The autumn wind swept across the Iowa plains, bending the golden wheat like waves on an amber ocean. The distant rumble of a tractor engine echoed across the Thompson family farm, 240 acres of America's heartland that had weathered dust bowls, depressions, and droughts for 4 generations. I remember that day clearly, the last time I saw Grandpa Richard alive. October 1973, while the rest of the country was glued to their television sets watching the Watergate hearings, our family crisis was unfolding quietly among the cornfields. Grandpa sat in his weathered rocking chair on the porch, his calloused hands carefully turning the pages of an old leather-bound album. The evening sun cast long shadows across his face, deepening the wrinkles earned from decades under the Midwestern sky. "Jack," he said, his voice dropping to a near whisper, as if sharing a national secret. "Sometimes the most valuable things are hidden where people least expect to find them. Don't ever forget that, grandson." His eyes, still sharp despite his 82 years, held mine for a moment longer than usual. 1 week later, his heart gave out while checking the irrigation system in the North Field. When Attorney Richardson read the will in his oak-paneled office downtown, I knew something wasn't right. The 240-acre farm, the red barn that had stood for over a century, and the John Deere 4020 tractor that Grandpa had treated better than most men treat their wives, all of it went to my brother Dean. I received $15,000, and it's Grandpa's old pickup truck. That wasn't the Richard Thompson I knew, a man who preached fairness and family responsibility with the same conviction as Sunday's pastor. As Dean avoided my eyes across the attorney's polished desk, I hadn't yet understood the true meaning behind Grandpa's final words. But the secret hidden in that fence post was about to change everything, not just for our family, but for farmers across 3 counties. The gravel crunched beneath the tires of Grandpa's 1965 Ford F-100 as I pulled into the farm's driveway one final time. Dean wouldn't officially take possession until tomorrow, and I needed this last moment with the only real home I'd ever known. The white farmhouse stood against the evening sky, its wraparound porch empty now without Grandpa's rocking chair. The red barn, freshly painted last summer, glowed crimson in the sunset. Memories flooded back as I stepped onto the property. Running through sprinklers on hot July afternoons, Grandpa teaching Dean and me to drive the tractor, his patient voice guiding our nervous hands. The sweet scent of Grandma's apple pies cooling on the windowsill before she passed when I was 14. This land wasn't just dirt and buildings. It was the foundation of everything I understood about family hard work and belonging. I walked toward the barn and its massive wooden doors groaning on their hinges as I pushed them open. The familiar smell of hay motor oil and livestock enveloped me. Grandpa's workbench stood along the eastern wall, tools arranged with military precision. The John Deere 4020 gleamed under the single overhead bulb. Dean had already been polishing it, I noticed. "Thought you might come by." The voice startled me. Dean stepped from the shadows of the hayloft ladder, wiping his hands on a rag. My brother had always been the spitting image of Grandpa, tall, broad-shouldered, with the same weathered complexion from endless days in the fields. 5 years older than my 30, he'd stayed when I'd left for agricultural college, cementing his position as Grandpa's natural heir. "Just saying goodbye," I said, trying to keep the bitterness from my voice. Dean nodded, running his hand along the tractor's fender. "I know this isn't what you expected, Jack, but Grandpa had his reasons. He wanted the farm to stay whole, to stay working." The implication was clear. I'd chosen education over agriculture, books over barns. In Dean's mind, and apparently in Grandpa's too, I'd forfeited my claim to this legacy when I'd driven away to the University of Iowa 12 years ago. "He raised us both," I said, "taught us both everything we know about this land." "But I stayed," Dean replied simply. "I was here for the drought of '64, for the bank almost foreclosing in '68, for every midnight repair and dawn harvest." "Where were you?" I had no answer that wouldn't sound defensive. I'd been learning advanced agricultural science, irrigation techniques, soil composition, knowledge that could have helped the farm if I'd been given the chance to apply it. "You know, he wasn't thinking clearly at the end," I tried. "The medication for his heart." "Don't," Dean cut me off, his voice hardening, "but don't dishonor him by suggesting he didn't know his own mind. The will is legal. It's done." He turned away, busying himself with some invisible task on the tractor. Our conversation was over. But as I turned to leave, my eye caught something on Grandpa's workbench, a leather-bound journal I didn't recognize. Grandpa had always been meticulous about recording crop rotations, weather patterns, and equipment maintenance. Is that new? I asked, nodding toward the book. Dean glanced over his shoulder. Found it in his bedroom after he passed. Just some old notes, farming stuff. Nothing important. Something in his tone made me suspicious. Dean had never been a good liar, a trait Grandpa had always appreciated about him, and with a casual movement, I picked up the journal, flipping it open to a random page. Mind if I take a look? Dean moved toward me quickly. Too quickly. It's just boring farm records. Besides, I already promised it to the County Historical Society. Before he could reach me, I'd already seen enough. Diagrams of the farm layout with strange markings at specific locations, notes in Grandpa's distinctive handwriting about soil samples and germination rates, but with terminology far more technical than typical farmers' records. Since when does the Historical Society care about soil pH levels? I asked, continuing to flip through pages. Dean snatched the book from my hands. I've got work to do, Jack. Lock up when you leave. He tucked the journal firmly under his arm and strode toward the house, tension evident in every step. I stood alone in the barn, more confused than ever. What was in that journal that Dean didn't want me to see? And why would Grandpa, who had always treated us equally, cut me out of his legacy so completely? The next morning dawned clear and cool. Perfect harvesting weather, as Grandpa would have said. Instead of heading back to my apartment in Des Moines, I found myself driving toward Pete Johnson's farm adjacent to our property. If anyone might know something about Grandpa's state of mind in his final days, it would be Pete. The two had been friends for over 50 years, sharing equipment, weather forecasts, and more than a few bottles of whiskey on their respective porches. Pete's farm was smaller than ours, about 120 acres, but immaculately maintained. At 77, he still worked the fields himself with occasional help from his grandchildren. I found him in his front yard adjusting the carburetor on an ancient rototiller. Jack Thompson, he called out, straightening with a grimace as his back protested. Been wondering when you'd stop by. I helped him to his feet, noting how frail he seemed compared to my last visit at Christmas. Good to see you, Mr. Johnson. Cut that Mr. nonsense. I've known you since you were in diapers. He gestured toward the house. Come on in. Martha made cinnamon rolls this morning. Pete's kitchen was a time capsule of 1950s Americana, checkered curtains, formica tabletop, and a refrigerator that hummed louder than a tractor engine. Martha Johnson, tiny and bird-like at 75, fussed over coffee and pastries while I settled at the table. Terrible business about the will, Pete said without preamble once Martha had retreated to her garden. Not like Richard at all. Relief flooded through me, so I wasn't the only one who thought something was amiss. Did he say anything to you about his plans for the farm? Pete's weathered face creased in thought. He always said the farm would support both you boys. Different ways, maybe. Dean with his hands in the soil and you with your fancy education improving things. But both of you nonetheless. The will left everything to Dean, I said. The entire farm. Pete shook his head. That doesn't square with what he told me just 3 weeks before he passed. Said he was updating some papers to make sure you both had your fair share. My pulse quickened. Did he mention a lawyer or where these papers might be? Richardson, same as always, but Richard had his own way of doing important things. Pete leaned forward. Your grandpa was a careful man, Jack. More careful than most folks knew. What do you mean? Pete glanced toward the window to ensure Martha wasn't within earshot. Did you know your grandpa worked for the Department of Agriculture before he took over the family farm? This was news to me. I knew he went to agricultural college before the war, but he never mentioned working for the government. Oh yes, early 1950s before your father was born. Richard was some kind of seed specialist, developing hardier wheat varieties. Brilliant mind behind that farmer's exterior. Pete sipped his coffee. He didn't talk about it much, but I remember him saying it was important work. Work that could have made him rich if he'd been the type to care about money. I tried to reconcile this information with the grandfather I knew. The practical, hard-working farmer who could predict rain 3 days out by the smell of the wind, but who'd never mentioned any scientific background. Did Dean know about this? Pete shrugged. Richard might have told him. Those two spent a lot of time together these past years. There's a journal, I said. Dean has it now, full of technical notes about the farm, soil compositions, growth rates, things like that. Pete nodded slowly. Sounds like Richard. He was always experimenting, always keeping records. That's why his yields were consistently higher than anyone else's around here, even in bad years. And you think this might have something to do with the will? I don't know, son, but I do know Richard Thompson wouldn't have cut you out without a damn good reason, or without making sure there was a way to set things right if needed. Pete's words followed me as I drove back to the farm. The property looked different now, knowing that Grandpa had been more than just a gifted farmer. He'd been a trained agricultural scientist conducting his own quiet experiments year after year. Dean's truck was gone when I arrived, probably in town finalizing paperwork with Richardson. This gave me the perfect opportunity to investigate without interference. If Grandpa had updated his will or left other documents, they had to be somewhere on the property. I started in his bedroom, a Spartan space with a single-bed oak dresser and bedside table holding a Bible and reading glasses. The closet yielded nothing but neatly pressed work shirts and his one Sunday suit. The dresser drawers contained the expected items: underwear, socks, a few faded photographs of Grandma. Moving to a small office off the kitchen, I methodically searched through the filing cabinet. Tax records, equipment, manuals, seed catalogs, everything organized with Grandpa's characteristic precision, but nothing resembling updated legal documents. As I turned to leave, my eye caught a small wooden box on the bookshelf, partially hidden behind agricultural almanacs. I'd never seen it before. The box was hand-carved maple with a simple brass latch. Inside lay a collection of black and white photographs I'd never seen. A younger Grandpa Richard stood with a group of men in white lab coats, all posed before a government building. Another showed him examining wheat samples in what looked like a laboratory. A third captured him shaking hands with a distinguished-looking man beside a sign reading Bureau of Plant Industry, U.S. Department of Agriculture. Beneath the photos lay an official-looking certificate naming Richard Thompson as a senior research specialist with the department's Special Projects Division from 1952 and 1954. So Pete had been right. Grandpa had been a government scientist before returning to full-time farming. But why had he never mentioned this part of his life? And what did it have to do with his will? At the bottom of the box, I found a small leather-bound notebook, different from the journal Dean had taken. This one was older, the pages yellowed with age. Opening it revealed drawings of wheat varieties with detailed annotations about genetic characteristics, resistance factors, and yield potentials. The technical language was far beyond typical farmer's knowledge. Terms like recessive allele expression and drought-resistant phenotypes. Most intriguing was a hand-drawn map of the farm with certain areas marked with symbols that corresponded to notes about soil composition and experimental plantings. One section, near the southwest corner of the property, was circled repeatedly with the notation, primary control site, baseline maintain. I needed to see the journal Dean had taken. Between these two notebooks, Grandpa had recorded decades of scientific work that went far beyond simple farming. Something valuable enough, perhaps, to hide from public knowledge. As the sun began to set, I walked the property following the locations marked on Grandpa's map. Most showed no visible differences from the surrounding farmland, but the primary control site near the southwest corner drew my attention. This area bordered Pete Johnson's property, marked by an old fence line that Grandpa had personally maintained for decades. The fence posts, sturdy cedar logs sunk deep into the ground, looked ordinary enough, but I remembered how Grandpa had insisted on replacing several of them himself just last year, refusing help even from Dean. At the time, we'd attributed it to his stubborn independence. Now I wondered if there had been another reason. The southwest corner post looked newer than the others, the wood less weathered. Examining it closely, I noticed something unusual. The top cap wasn't a solid piece as it appeared from a distance, but a separate component fitted precisely to the post beneath. Memories surfaced of Grandpa teaching Dean and me to whittle on the porch steps, showing us how to create hidden compartments in wooden boxes. "A man needs a place for his private thoughts," he had said with a wink. With careful pressure, I worked at the cap until it loosened. It had been cleverly crafted to look like part of the post, while actually being removable by someone who knew what to look for. Inside the hollow post, wrapped in waterproof plastic, was a manila envelope. My hands trembled as I extracted it. The weight and thickness suggested multiple documents inside. Finding a dry spot under a nearby oak tree, I carefully opened the package. Inside were two documents, a handwritten letter addressed to my grandsons, and a legal document that made my breath catch, a will dated just 3 weeks before Grandpa's death. The letter was in Grandpa's distinctive handwriting, the same neat script that had labeled every tool in the barn and recorded 60 years of weather patterns. Jack and Dean, if you're reading this, I'm gone, and something has happened to prevent my real wishes from being carried out. I've hidden this will here because I've recently discovered troubling information about Dean's actions. 2 months ago, I overheard Dean speaking with a representative from Agrigrow Corporation about selling specialized seed formulas I've developed over the decades. Formulas that could revolutionize farming in drought-prone regions, but that I've deliberately kept private to prevent corporate exploitation of small farmers. When confronted, Dean admitted he'd been in talks with them for months, convinced that selling my research was the smartest financial move for the family. What he doesn't understand is that this work was never meant to make us rich. It was meant to help farmers like us survive when others fail. More disturbing, I discovered Dean has been meeting with a lawyer in Cedar Rapids, discussing ways to ensure he would inherit the entire farm and my research. He even asked about challenging wills and proving mental incompetence. The will that Richardson has is not my true testament. Dean convinced me to sign what he claimed were updated insurance documents while I was recovering from my heart episode in August. I suspect those papers were actually a fraudulent will, designed to give him complete control. My true wishes are contained in the enclosed document, which leaves the farm equally to both of you, with specific provisions for my agricultural research to be shared with the State University's farming cooperative, not sold to corporate interest. I'm sorry to burden you with this knowledge, Jack. I had hoped Dean would understand the true value of what we do here goes beyond money. Perhaps he still can with your guidance. Your loving grandfather, Richard Thompson. The legal document confirmed everything in the letter. A properly executed will dividing the property equally between Dean and me, with detailed provisions for Grandpa's agricultural research to be donated to the State University's Agricultural Extension Program. Shock gave way to anger as I considered the implications. My own brother had not only manipulated our grandfather, but had actively worked to steal my inheritance and betray Grandpa's life's work. And for what money from a corporation that would patent and profit from techniques developed to help ordinary farmers? As the final light faded from the sky, I carefully returned the documents to their waterproof covering and placed them in my jacket pocket. Tomorrow I would take them to Richardson and expose Dean's deception. But tonight I needed to understand exactly what made Grandpa's agricultural techniques so valuable that Dean would betray his own family to sell them. With flashlight in hand, I returned to the farmhouse. Dean's truck was still gone, probably spending the night celebrating in town. I went straight to Grandpa's office and began a more thorough search, looking for any additional research materials he might have hidden. Behind the old roll-top desk, I discovered a loose floorboard. Prying it up revealed a metal lockbox, the kind used for fire protection of important documents. The key had always hung on Grandpa's keychain, which Dean now possessed, but the simple lock was no match for a determined screwdriver. Inside lay decades of meticulous research, data tables, crossbreeding records, and soil treatment formulas. Most significant was a thick folder labeled Drought-Resistant Soil Enhancement, Formula 7. The opening page stated in Grandpa's handwriting, Final version, Pune, tested and confirmed effective through 3 drought cycles, 1959, 1964, 1970. The technical details were beyond my immediate comprehension, despite my agricultural education, but the summary was clear enough. Grandpa had developed a method of treating soil that significantly increased its moisture retention and nutrient delivery during drought conditions. His test plots had shown 70 to 80% yield maintenance during drought years, when surrounding farms suffered 50% or greater losses. This wasn't just clever farming. This was revolutionary agricultural science disguised as an old man's knack for growing things. And according to the records, he'd been refining it since his days at the Department of Agriculture, continuing the research they'd abandoned when funding priorities shifted. A knock at the door startled me. Hastily replacing the documents and sliding the lockbox back into its hiding place, I moved to answer it, expecting Dean's return. Instead, I found Dr. Margaret Wilson on the porch, a professor of agricultural science from the State University and an occasional consultant to local farms on pest management. In her 60s, with silver hair pulled back in a practical bun, she'd helped me with my thesis research years earlier. "Jack," she said, surprise evident in her voice, "I didn't expect to find you here. I was looking for your brother." "Dr. Wilson, he's not here right now. Is there something I can help with?" She hesitated. "I received an unusual letter from your grandfather about a week before he passed. He wanted me to review some research notes but didn't say what they contained. I've been meaning to stop by, but with the semester starting, I made a split-second decision. You might want to come in. There's something you should see." Over coffee at the kitchen table, I showed her the notebook I'd found earlier, careful not to mention the will or Dean's deception yet. Her expression changed from professional interest to astonishment as she turned the pages. "This is extraordinary," she murmured. "Some of these techniques were theoretical when I was in graduate school. The documentation here suggests he's been successfully implementing them for decades." "What exactly am I looking at, Dr. Wilson?" She looked up, eyes bright with academic excitement. "A comprehensive system for developing drought-resistant farmland without genetic modification or heavy chemical treatment. If these results are verifiable," she paused, "Jack, this could help thousands of farms across the Midwest, especially with the climate patterns changing as they have been. Would a company like AgriGrow be interested in this research?" Her expression darkened. "They'd pay millions for it, then patent it, package it, and sell it back to farmers at prices most couldn't afford. Is that what's happening here? Is someone trying to sell Richard's work?" Before I could answer, headlights swept across the window as a vehicle pulled into the driveway. Dean's truck. "Dr. Wilson, I need to ask you to keep what you've seen confidential for now. There are complications with my grandfather's estate I'm trying to resolve." She nodded, understanding in her eyes. "Richard always said you were the thoughtful one. I'll wait to hear from you before discussing this with anyone." Dean entered, surprise registering on his face at finding us in the kitchen. "Wilson, Jack. What's going on here?" "Just stopping by to express my condolences," Dr. Wilson said smoothly, rising from her chair. "Richard was an exceptional man. The agricultural community has lost one of its quiet giants." Dean's eyes narrowed suspiciously. "Yes, he was. Thank you for coming by." After seeing Dr. Wilson out, Dean turned to me. "I thought you'd be back in Des Moines by now." "I needed more time," I said simply. "Well, it's late. I've had a long day signing paperwork. We can talk in the morning if you want." His tone made it clear he expected me to be gone by then. I nodded, retreating to my old bedroom upstairs. Sleep was impossible as I considered my options. The evidence of Dean's fraud was secure in my pocket, but exposing him immediately might risk Grandpa's research falling into corporate hands during the legal battle that would surely follow. I needed to understand more about the research, about Dean's connections with AgriGrow, and about what Grandpa had really intended for his life's work. Dawn found me in the barn examining the John Deere 4020 that had been central to so many of my childhood memories. The tractor gleamed under the early morning light, streaming through the high windows. Grandpa had purchased it new in 1968, a significant investment that had paid dividends through reliability and performance. "She's a beauty, isn't she?" Dean's voice came from behind me. He'd always been an early riser like Grandpa. "Best tractor ever made," I agreed, running my hand along the smooth green metal. This machine had taught me about maintenance responsibility and the satisfaction of work well done. Dean approached, coffee mug in hand. "Look, Jack, about yesterday. I know this inheritance situation isn't what you expected, but I'm planning to offer you a job here, assistant manager, good salary, profit sharing. You could apply that education of yours." The offer caught me off guard. Was this an attempt at reconciliation, or did Dean suspect I was getting close to the truth and want to keep me where he could watch me? "That's generous," I said cautiously, "but I need to know something first. What do you know about Grandpa's research? The soil treatments, the drought resistance techniques." Dean's expression hardened almost imperceptibly. "Just old farmers' tricks. Nothing special." That's not what Dr. Wilson thought when she saw his notebooks. Coffee sloshed over the rim of Dean's mug as his hand tightened. "You showed her his private papers. You had no right. And you had no right to forge his will," I said quietly. The silence between us stretched taut as barbed wire. Dean's face cycled through shock denial and finally a calculating assessment. You can't prove anything, he said finally. I pulled the envelope from my jacket. Actually, I can. Grandpa's real will. His letter explaining how you tricked him into signing fake documents. It's all here. Dean set his mug down on the tractor's fender, his movements deliberate. Where did you find that? Where Grandpa knew I would look. He told me himself in his way. The most valuable things are hidden where people least expect to find them. Understanding dawned in Dean's eyes. The fence post, the one he insisted on replacing himself. I nodded. Why, Dean? We could have shared the farm, shared the research. Why betray him like this? Dean's shoulders slumped, fight going out of him momentarily. You don't understand what it's been like. Working this land year after year, watching other farms fail around us, knowing we had the solution but couldn't share it because of Grandpa's paranoia about corporations. So you decided to sell out to the very people he was protecting farmers from. AgriGrow offered $2 million, Jack. $2 million for formulas sitting in notebooks, gathering dust. Do you know what we could do with that kind of money? Modernize the entire operation. Expand to the Russell property next door. Secure our future for generations. At the expense of every small farmer who couldn't afford whatever price AgriGrow decided to charge for the technology. Dean's expression hardened again. That's business. That's progress. Grandpa was living in the past, holding on to some idealistic vision of farming that doesn't exist anymore. He was protecting a way of life. Our way of life. No, your way of life was in Des Moines with your degrees and your research papers. You left Jack. You don't get to come back now and claim the moral high ground. Dean's voice rose with each word. I left to learn, Dean, to bring back knowledge that could help the farm. Grandpa understood that. It's why he supported my education. Dean laughed bitterly. Yet he confided in me about his research, not you. He showed me the techniques, the special plots. Me, not his college-educated grandson. This revelation stung, but I pushed past it. If he trusted you so much, why did he hide his real will? Why did he suspect you would betray him? Because he was becoming paranoid at the end, seeing corporate spies behind every barn door. The medication was affecting his mind. I shook my head. The letter is clear and rational. He overheard your conversation with AgriGrow. He confronted you about it. Dean's expression shifted, calculation replacing anger. What are you going to do with those documents? Go to Richardson, start a legal battle that could drag on for years. By the time it's settled, neither of us might have a farm left to inherit. I want the truth, Dean. All of it. Then we figure out how to honor Grandpa's real wishes. Dean glanced toward the house, then back to me. Fine. You want the truth? Yes. I approached AgriGrow. Yes, I arranged for Grandpa to sign a will he didn't fully understand. But I did it for this farm, for our family legacy. By stealing my half of the inheritance. By ensuring the decisions would be made by someone who understands farming, not academic theories. Dean's control slipped, revealing the resentment that had clearly been building for years. You think reading books about agriculture makes you a farmer? You haven't had soil under your fingernails in 12 years, Jack. That doesn't justify fraud, Dean. His eyes narrowed. What do you want? Half the farm? Fine. But the research is different. That's worth millions, and I've already signed a preliminary agreement with AgriGrow. You what? The implications were staggering. You sold research you don't even legally own. I made a business decision to secure our future. Dean stepped closer, his voice dropping. Be smart about this, Jack. We can both win here. Take your half of the land, take a cut of the AgriGrow deal. Everyone profits. Except all the farmers. Grandpa wanted to help. I stepped back, creating distance between us. I'm taking these documents to Richardson today. What happens next is up to the legal system. Dean's face transformed, the calculating businessman replaced by something darker. I can't let you do that. He lunged forward, grabbing for the envelope. I jerked back, but Dean's farm strength and grip caught my jacket. We struggled, the envelope dropping to the barn floor between us. Dean shoved me hard against the tractor, reaching for the documents. In the scuffle, his coffee mug toppled from the fender, hot liquid splashing across the papers. No, Dean shouted, scrambling to rescue the documents. But the damage was done. Coffee had soaked through the outer envelope, staining the contents. I took advantage of his distraction to retrieve the papers, quickly checking the damage. The will was partially stained but still legible. Grandpa's letter had taken the worst of it, but the crucial information remained intact. Dean stood breathing heavily, realizing his mistake. Jack, listen to me. This isn't just about money. AgriGrow has the resources to take Grandpa's research global, to help farmers worldwide. Isn't that better than keeping it locked in a university filing cabinet? That should have been Grandpa's decision to make, not yours. The rumble of an approaching vehicle interrupted us. Through the barn door, I saw Pete Johnson's ancient pickup truck pulling into the yard, followed by Dr. Wilson's sedan. Dean's expression turned desperate. What did you do? I called them this morning. Pete knew Grandpa better than anyone, and Dr. Wilson can help us understand exactly what we're dealing with here. Pete emerged from his truck with surprising agility for his age, while Dr. Wilson carried a leather briefcase. Their arrival created the audience I needed, witnesses to prevent Dean from taking more drastic action. I found Grandpa's real will, I announced as they approached the barn, and evidence that Dean forged the one that was executed. Pete's weathered face registered disappointment rather than surprise as he looked at Dean. Your grandfather was right to be concerned then. You knew, Dean asked incredulously. Richard confided his suspicions to me the week before he died, asked me to keep an eye on things to help Jack if needed. Pete's tone was heavy with regret. I hoped he was wrong about you, son. Wilson stepped forward. In the research materials, the drought resistance techniques, I held up the coffee-stained envelope. It's all documented here, along with Grandpa's wish for it to go to the university's agricultural cooperative, not to corporate interests. Dean's shoulders slumped in defeat, the fight visibly leaving him. You don't understand what you're throwing away. The money could have transformed this place. This place doesn't need transformation, Dean, Pete said gently. It needs stewardship. That's what your grandfather provided for 60 years. That's what he hoped you both would continue. Blanche Wilson examined the stained documents I handed her. These formulas, these techniques, they're remarkably sophisticated. Richard was decades ahead of conventional agricultural science. She looked up at me. He mentions experimental plots on the property. I'd like to see them if possible. I can show you, Dean said unexpectedly. The primary test site is behind the barn. There are others at the locations marked in his journals. His cooperation surprised me. Dean, he met my eyes, resignation replacing the earlier calculation. What's done is done. The research was always the most important thing to Grandpa. More important than the land itself. If you're determined to follow his wishes, I might as well help make sure it's done right. Was this another manipulation or a genuine change of heart? I couldn't be sure, but with Pete and Dr. Wilson present, I felt we could proceed safely. There's something else you should see, Dean continued, leading us toward the old tool shed behind the barn. Something Grandpa showed only me. The tool shed had always been off limits during our childhood. Grandpa's private domain, where dangerous chemicals and equipment were stored. Dean produced a key from his pocket and unlocked the heavy padlock. Inside, past the expected arrangement of pesticides and fertilizers, Dean moved aside a large storage cabinet to reveal a door built into the back wall. A second key opened this hidden entrance, revealing a small room that took my breath away. A miniature laboratory spread before us, nothing sophisticated by university standards, but impressive for a rural farm. Basic microscope, seed germination trays, soil testing equipment, and walls lined with carefully labeled samples and notebooks. His private research space, Dean explained. He set it up in the 1950s after leaving the Department of Agriculture. Been improving it ever since. Dr. Wilson moved through the series with reverent appreciation. This is extraordinary. A lifetime of independent research conducted right under everyone's noses. He called it his thinking room, Dean said. Spent hours in here, especially during winter months, when fieldwork was minimal. I ran my fingers along the spines of dozens of notebooks arranged chronologically on metal shelving. All these years, he never mentioned any of this to me. He was going to, Dean said quietly. After your last visit at Christmas, he told me it was time to bring you fully into the work. Said your education would be the missing piece that could help take his research to the next level. He paused. That's when AgriGrow approached me. Their timing was convenient. The pieces were falling into place. They knew about his work somehow. They approached you specifically because Grandpa was planning to involve me. Dean nodded reluctantly. Their representative mentioned that your grandfather's crop yields had been noticed over the years. Too consistent, too resistant to regional drought patterns to be explained by conventional methods. Dr. Wilson was examining soil samples labeled with dates and locations. Corporate agricultural intelligence is sophisticated these days. They monitor satellite imagery, purchase patterns, even county fair results. If Richard's fields were consistently outperforming neighbors by significant margins, they would have noticed. And they saw Dean as the weak link, Pete observed bluntly, the grandson who might be tempted by money. Dean flushed but didn't deny it. $2 million is hard to refuse when you've been working the same land for 30 years with little to show for it beyond survival. Survival is no small achievement in farming, Pete reminded him. Most haven't managed even that. Dr. Wilson closed her examination of a soil treatment formula. This work needs to be protected, studied, and eventually shared with the farming community, exactly as Richard intended. Jack, with your permission, I'd like to bring in a small team from the university to properly document everything before we move any materials. I looked to Dean, curious about his reaction. He nodded slowly. Grandpa wanted this to help people not just make money. I lost sight of that. If we do this through the university, at least his name will be attached to the work. He deserves that recognition. For the first time, I felt a glimmer of hope that Dean might be salvageable, that his betrayal had been motivated by misguided financial pragmatism rather than pure greed. What about the legal situation, Pete asked. The forged will. Dean's momentary cooperation faltered. I can't go to jail, Jack. The farm would fall apart without daily management. I'm not looking to press charges, I said, surprising myself with the realization that it was true. I want Grandpa's wishes honored, the farm divided as he intended, his research protected. If we can resolve this without criminal proceedings, I'm willing to try. Relief washed over Dean's face. Thank you. I made a terrible mistake. I see that now. Dr. Wilson cleared her throat. There's also the matter of your agreement with AgriGrow. They won't simply walk away from potential profits of this magnitude. Dean grimaced. The agreement was preliminary, contingent on my securing full ownership of the intellectual property after Grandpa's death. With the real will surfacing, I legally can't deliver what I promised. They still know the research exists, I pointed out. They could cause problems. I may have a solution, Dr. Wilson offered. The university has successfully defended agricultural innovations before. If we file provisional patents in Richard's name and immediately assign them to the agricultural cooperative, as he wished, we create a legal barrier to corporate appropriation. Pete nodded approvingly. Richard would have appreciated that approach, using their own system against them. The morning stretched into afternoon as we continued exploring Grandpa's hidden legacy. With each notebook examined, each experimental plot visited, I felt closer to the grandfather I thought I'd known completely, but had only partially understood. His research was impressive even to Dr. Wilson's expert assessment, practical innovations developed through decades of patient observation and experimentation without the benefit of sophisticated laboratory equipment. The drought-resistant soil enhancement techniques were his crowning achievement, a system that could help farmers maintain productivity even as climate patterns became less predictable. Your grandfather was a visionary, Dr. Wilson told me, as we examined a test plot behind the barn where the soil had been treated with Grandpa's formula for over 15 years. He understood sustainable agriculture before it became fashionable in academic circles. I just wish I'd known about this while he was alive, I said. All those years I spent studying agricultural science, and the most innovative researcher I could have learned from was right here. He was proud of you, Jack, Pete assured me. Talked about your studies all the time. Said you were getting the formal education he never had the opportunity to complete. Dean had been quietly cooperative throughout the afternoon, answering questions about Grandpa's research methods and showing us locations of various experimental plots across the farm. As the sun began to set, we gathered again in the farmhouse kitchen. What happens now? Dean asked the question directed at me. Tomorrow we take Grandpa's will to Richardson, explain the situation, and begin the legal process of correcting the inheritance. I met his eyes directly. I won't press criminal charges for the forgery if you cooperate fully with transferring the research to the university cooperative and honoring Grandpa's wishes. Dean nodded slowly. And agri-grow. I'll handle them, Dr. Wilson said confidently. The university's legal department has dealt with corporate agricultural interests before. Once they understand the research is legally protected and designated for public benefit, they'll back off. And the farm, Dean persisted. Grandpa's will splits it equally, but neither of us can run half a farm effectively. It was the practical question I'd been considering all day. I propose we operate it as a partnership. You handle the day-to-day operations you're experienced with. I'll manage the business side and work with the university to implement Grandpa's innovations more systematically. Pete smiled approvingly. That's exactly what Richard hoped would happen. Each of you contributing your strengths. Dean extended his hand across the table. Partners, then. I hesitated, the wound of his betrayal still fresh. Partners on probation, I amended, shaking his hand firmly. Trust will take time to rebuild. As Pete and Dr. Wilson prepared to leave, promising to return the next day with university representatives, I walked them to their vehicles. The evening air carried the sweet scent of ripening corn from the surrounding fields. Your grandfather would be proud of how you've handled this, Pete said, clapping me on the shoulder. He always said you had the temperament for difficult situations, steady, thoughtful, looking for solutions rather than someone to blame. I'm still angry with Dean, I admitted. Part of me wants to see him face consequences. He will, Pete assured me. Living with what he almost threw away, that's consequence enough for a man with any conscience. And Dean does have a conscience despite this lapse in judgment. Dr. Wilson offered her hand. Richard Thompson's legacy is secure now thanks to you. His work will help countless farmers adapt to changing conditions. There's no greater tribute to a man who dedicated his life to agriculture. As their vehicles disappeared down the long driveway, I turned back toward the farmhouse, the only real home I'd ever known despite my years away. The white clapboard structure stood silhouetted against the darkening sky windows, glowing with warm light. Dean's silhouette moved past an upstairs window, preparing the guest room where I'd sleep tonight. Tomorrow would bring lawyers, university officials, and the beginning of a new chapter for the Thompson farm. But tonight, standing where generations of my family had stood before me, I felt Grandpa's presence in the rustle of the corn, the distant lowing of cattle, and the enduring promise of the land. The fence post that had hidden his final message still stood at the southwest corner of the property, an ordinary-looking piece of cedar that had preserved extraordinary truth. Sometimes, as Grandpa had said, the most valuable things are hidden where people least expect to find them. The morning sun painted long shadows across the Thompson farm as Attorney Richardson examined the documents spread before him on his polished mahogany desk. The coffee-stained will, Grandpa's handwritten letter, and the preliminary agreement between Dean and Agri-Grow Corporation formed a triangle of legal complications that had the elderly lawyer removing his glasses and pinching the bridge of his nose. In 37 years of practice, I've never encountered a situation quite like this one. The evidence of fraud is substantial, Jack. Your grandfather's authentic will bears all the proper witnesses and notarization. The document Dean presented after Richard's death shares none of these legal necessities, though the signature is a remarkably convincing forgery. Richardson replaced his glasses, leaning forward with the gravity of a judge delivering a verdict. Under normal circumstances, I would be obligated to report this to the district attorney. Forgery of a will is a serious criminal offense in this state. Dean shifted uncomfortably in his chair, eyes fixed on his weathered work boots. However, as this is a family matter, and you've expressed a desire to resolve it privately, there may be another path forward. The court could set aside the fraudulent will and recognize the authentic one without pursuing criminal charges, provided all parties agree to the terms. I glanced at Dean, who nodded slightly without looking up. That's what we want, to honor Grandpa's real wishes without dragging the family name through a public scandal. Richardson made a notation on his legal pad, his fountain pen scratching softly against the yellow paper. Very well, I'll file the necessary motions this afternoon. The court generally expedites probate matters when fraud is involved, so we should have a resolution within days rather than weeks. He turned his attention to the Agri-Grow agreement, adjusting his glasses as he studied the corporate letterhead. This preliminary contract, however, presents additional complications. Dean had no legal authority to negotiate the sale of intellectual property that wasn't solely his to sell even under the fraudulent will. The research belonged to your grandfather at the time this agreement was signed. Dean finally spoke, his voice rough with emotion. Agrigro won't just walk away. Their representative Harrington has been calling daily for updates. They know there's valuable research here, whether I can deliver it legally or not. Dr. Wilson, who had accompanied us to the meeting, leaned forward. That's why we need to move quickly with the university's patent attorneys. We've already begun documenting Richard's work. If we can establish legal protection before Agrigro takes more aggressive action, we can fulfill Richard's wish to make the research available through the agricultural cooperative. Richardson nodded, making another notation. I know several excellent intellectual property attorneys who specialize in agricultural innovations. I'll make some calls this afternoon. As we left Richardson's office, the weight of our situation settled fully upon my shoulders. Dean and I walked in silence down Main Street past Harwell's Hardware, where Grandpa had bought his tools for 40 years, past Miller's Diner, where he'd eaten the same breakfast. 2 eggs over easy wheat toast, black coffee, every Saturday morning of my childhood. They're going to come after us, Dean said, finally pausing before we reached our vehicles. Agrigro, they don't like losing. Let them try. Grandpa's research is going where he wanted it to go. Dean's face had lost the calculating edge I'd seen in the barn, replaced by genuine concern. You don't understand what we're dealing with, Jack. These aren't small-town businessmen. Their legal team makes Richardson look like a first-year law student, and they have connections in places that could make life very difficult for us. What kind of connections? Dean glanced around, lowering his voice despite the empty sidewalk. Harrington mentioned friends in the Department of Agriculture who could suddenly find health violations on our farm, friends at the county assessor's office who might reassess our property taxes. You know how these things work in the real world. I did know, but standing on the main street of the town where Grandpa had built his reputation on honesty and hard work, I couldn't bring myself to surrender to corporate intimidation. We do this right, Dean, whatever it costs us. That's what he would have wanted. The drive back to the farm took us past fields ready for harvest, corn standing tall and golden under the October sun. Farmers throughout the county were bringing in their combines, preparing for the annual ritual that determined their financial fate for the coming year. Wilson had arranged for 3 colleagues from the university's agricultural department to meet us at the farm: Dr. Robert Chen, a soil specialist, Dr. Sarah Thornton, an expert in sustainable farming practices, and Professor James McAllister, who headed the university's agricultural patent office. They arrived in 2 university vehicles loaded with scientific equipment, soil sampling kits, cameras, portable microscopes, and laptops. Their presence transformed the quiet farmhouse into a hub of academic activity, with Grandpa's hidden laboratory serving as their base of operations. Your grandfather was brilliantly practical, Dr. Chen remarked as he examined soil samples from one of the experimental plots. He developed techniques that required minimal specialized equipment but produced maximum results. Most farmers could implement these methods with tools they already possess. Professor McAllister seemed less impressed with the practical applications and more concerned with the legal protections. The problem we face is that some of these techniques may not be patentable under current law. They're methods rather than distinct inventions. We'll do what we can to protect them legally, but we should prepare for challenges. Dr. Thornton, a woman in her 50s with the practical demeanor of someone raised on a farm, offered a different perspective. Patents aren't the only protection. Getting this information into the hands of the farming cooperative quickly creates a form of public ownership that makes corporate appropriation more difficult. If thousands of small farmers are already implementing these techniques before Agrigro can stake a claim, their legal position weakens substantially. The university team worked methodically throughout the day, documenting every aspect of Grandpa's research. Dean surprised me with his detailed knowledge of the experimental plots and treatment schedules. He'd clearly been involved in the practical implementation of Grandpa's work, even if he hadn't fully understood its significance. By late afternoon, Pete Johnson had joined us, bringing along several other elderly farmers from neighboring properties. Men who had known Grandpa for decades and had noticed his consistently superior yield without understanding the science behind them. Richard always said it was just good farming, Harold Finch remarked, His leathery face creased with admiration as Dr. Chen explained the soil enhancement technique. Never let on he was doing anything special, just quietly outperformed everyone else year after year. That was his way, Pete agreed. Never one to boast or draw attention. Just did what needed doing and let the results speak for themselves. As the day's light began to fade, Dr. Wilson gathered everyone in the farmhouse kitchen where Martha Johnson had arrived with enough food to feed a harvest crew. The mood was almost celebratory as the university team shared their preliminary findings and the local farmers contributed their observations of Grandpa's methods over the years. The harmony was interrupted by the crunch of tires on gravel as a black Lincoln town car pulled into the driveway. Through the kitchen window, I watched a tall man in an expensive suit emerge, his polished shoes incongruous against the dusty farmyard. Dean tensed beside me. Harrington. The AgriGrow representative approached the house with the confident stride of someone accustomed to getting his way. His knock, firm and authoritative, silenced the kitchen conversation. I opened the door, meeting the corporate representative eye to eye. Mr. Thompson Edward Harrington, AgriGrow Corporation. His handshake was firm, his smile practiced. I've been trying to reach your brother regarding our agreement. I see you have quite a gathering here today. His gaze moved past me to the kitchen, full of university personnel and local farmers. This is private property, Mr. Harrington. We didn't invite you. His smile didn't waver. Of course, I apologize for the intrusion. Perhaps we could speak privately. I believe there's been some misunderstanding regarding your grandfather's research that we should clarify. Dean joined me at the door, his earlier confidence diminished in Harrington's presence. Jack, maybe we should hear what he has to say. Something in Dean's tone suggested this wasn't merely courtesy. I stepped aside, allowing Harrington to enter, while the kitchen crowd watched with undisguised curiosity. Perhaps somewhere more private, Harrington suggested, eyeing the audience. Anything you have to say can be said in front of these people, I replied. They're all involved with preserving my grandfather's legacy. Harrington's smile tightened almost imperceptibly. As you wish. AgriGrow Corporation entered into a good faith agreement with Dean Thompson regarding certain agricultural innovations developed by Richard Thompson. We've invested considerable resources in preparation for this acquisition. Naturally, we were surprised to learn that there might be complications with our arrangement. Wilson stepped forward, introducing herself with professional courtesy that barely masked her hostility. The complications being that Mr. Thompson had no legal right to sell research that wasn't his, and that Richard Thompson explicitly wanted his work to benefit small farmers through the university cooperative, not corporate interests. Harrington absorbed this with practiced calm. Dr. Wilson, your reputation precedes you. AgriGrow has great respect for the university's agricultural programs. In fact, we fund several research initiatives on campus, none of which gives you claim to Richard Thompson's independent work, she replied crisply. Harrington turned his attention back to me. Mr. Thompson, I understand family legacies are important. AgriGrow respects that, which is why I'm authorized to offer a compromise that honors your grandfather while recognizing the practical realities of modern agriculture. He reached into his breast pocket, producing a business card that he handed to me. That's my direct line. Call when you're ready to discuss a partnership that would make the Thompson name synonymous with agricultural innovation while ensuring these techniques reach the widest possible audience. His emphasis on widest possible audience carried an unmistakable implication. The university's reach was limited compared to AgriGrow's global distribution network. I'll walk you to your car, Dean said, stepping outside with Harrington before I could respond. Their brief conversation by the Lincoln was intense but inaudible from the porch where I stood watching. Harrington passed something to Dean, an envelope that disappeared quickly into my brother's jacket pocket. When Dean returned, the kitchen had emptied onto the porch, everyone curious about the corporate intrusion. What did he give you? I asked quietly. Dean's expression was unreadable. Just his card, same as yours. I knew he was lying, but chose not to confront him in front of our guests. Whatever game Dean was playing with AgriGrow would have to wait until we were alone. As the university team packed up their equipment and the local farmers departed with promises to return tomorrow, Dr. Wilson lingered, her concern evident. Harrington's visit wasn't a coincidence, Jack. Someone told him about our activities here today. The implication hung in the air between us. Dean was still communicating with Agrigrow despite everything that had happened. We'll be fine, I assured her with more confidence than I felt. Richardson is filing the court motions tomorrow, and your team has documented everything. There's nothing Agrigrow can legally do to stop us. Her expression suggested she wasn't convinced. Corporate influence extends beyond legal channels, especially in agricultural communities. Be careful, and call me if anything else happens. After everyone had gone, Dean and I stood alone in the farmyard, the silence between us heavy with unspoken accusations. The evening air carried the scent of approaching rain, and in the distance, heat lightning illuminated the cloud banks building over the western horizon. You're still talking to them, I said finally. After everything, the fraud, the betrayal, all of it, you're still working with Agrigrow. Dean didn't deny it. I'm trying to find a middle path, Jack, one that doesn't end with us losing everything. What are you talking about? The farm is secure. The will is being corrected. Grandpa's research is going where he wanted it to go. Dean laughed bitterly. You think it's that simple? Agrigrow has already invested over $100,000 in preliminary development based on my description of Grandpa's techniques. They've got a legal department larger than our entire town, and they've got friends in places that can make life very difficult for independent farmers. So you're what? Hedging your bets? Playing both sides. He looked away toward the distant lightning. I'm trying to be realistic. The university is great for research, but they don't have the resources to defend against a determined corporate assault. And they certainly don't have the distribution network to get these techniques to farmers worldwide. That's not what Grandpa wanted. Grandpa is dead, Jack. We're the ones who have to live with the consequences of these decisions. The harsh truth of his statement hung between us like the approaching storm. Grandpa was gone, and the weight of his legacy now rested on our shoulders. Shoulders that were already strained by broken trust. What was in the envelope, Dean? He hesitated, then reached into his jacket pocket, producing a sealed business envelope. A revised offer, $2.5 million plus ongoing royalties for exclusive rights to Grandpa's soil enhancement techniques, and a promise to name the commercial product after him, Thompson's Yield Maximizer or something similar. Let me see it. He handed over the envelope. Inside was a formal letter on Agrigrow letterhead outlining exactly what Dean had described, plus one additional detail he'd omitted, a signing deadline of 48 hours. They're pressuring us to decide quickly before the legal proceedings are complete, I observed. That should tell you something about their ethics. Dean took back the letter, carefully returning it to the envelope. It tells me they're serious businessmen who recognize value when they see it. Think about what we could do with that money, Jack. Modernize the entire operation. Fund further research. Create something Grandpa would be proud of. He wouldn't be proud of us selling out everything he believed in. The first heavy raindrops began to fall, punctuating our standoff. Without another word, we retreated to the house, each lost in private thoughts about loyalty, legacy, and the uncertain future of the Thompson farm. The storm that rolled through overnight was the first major system of the fall season, delivering 2 inches of rain that transformed the farmyard into a patchwork of puddles reflecting the morning sky. I rose before dawn, unable to sleep, with the weight of decisions pressing down on me. The kitchen light was already on when I descended the stairs. Dean sat at the table nursing a cup of coffee, dark circles under his eyes, suggesting his night had been as restless as mine. Richardson called last night after you went to bed, he said without preamble. The court has agreed to an emergency hearing this afternoon regarding Grandpa's will. We both need to be there at 2 o'clock. I nodded, pouring myself coffee from the pot Dean had made. What about Agrigrow's deadline? Dean's expression tightened. It stands. By this time tomorrow, they want an answer. The answer is no, Dean. It will always be no. He set down his cup with deliberate control. I've been thinking about something Grandpa used to say. A good farmer adapts to changing conditions. The agriculture industry has changed since he developed these techniques. Family farms are disappearing. Corporate farming is the future whether we like it or not. That doesn't mean we have to help it happen. Maybe we can influence how it happens. Agrigrow is going to develop soil enhancement techniques with or without us. At least with our involvement, they'd be starting from Grandpa's research rather than creating something that might be less effective or more harmful to the environment. His argument had a certain twisted logic that I might have found compelling if I hadn't seen the evidence of his earlier deception. This isn't about the greater good, Dean. It's about the $2.5 million. The accusation hung between us like wood smoke and still air. Not entirely, he admitted after a long pause. But I won't pretend the money isn't a factor. Do you know how many years I've worked this land for barely enough profit to maintain the equipment? How many times I've watched neighboring farms go under while we survived by the skin of our teeth thanks to Grandpa's techniques? The raw emotion in his voice was genuine, and for a moment I glimpsed the weight he'd carried all these years. The pressure of preserving the family legacy while I pursued education and career opportunities elsewhere. I understand the temptation, I conceded, but it's not what Grandpa wanted. And after everything that's happened, I think we owe it to him to honor his wishes. Before Dean could respond, the phone rang, an unexpected sound at 5:30 in the morning. He answered with the wariness of someone who's learned that early calls rarely bring good news. His expression shifted from concern to alarm as he listened. When how bad will be right there. He hung up already reaching for his jacket. Pete Johnson's barn is on fire. Started about 20 minutes ago. Fire department is there, but it's already engulfed the main structure. We raced to the scene in Grandpa's old pickup, the pre-dawn darkness illuminated by the orange glow visible from a mile away. By the time we arrived, the main barn was beyond saving, a skeletal framework outlined in flames against the night sky. Firefighters focused on preventing the blaze from spreading to nearby structures as Pete stood watching his weathered face reflecting the inferno, consuming 6 decades of agricultural history. "Pete, are you all right?" I called as we approached. He turned, his expression a mixture of shock and grim resignation. "Nobody hurt. Got the livestock out in time. But the barn, all my equipment." Dean surveyed the destruction with a farmer's practiced eye. "What happened?" Pete shook his head slowly. "Fire chief says it looks like electrical, but I had that wiring checked just last spring. Everything was up to code." The implication hung unspoken in the smoke-filled air. This might not have been an accident. As dawn broke, neighbors arrived to offer assistance, forming the impromptu support network that had sustained rural communities for generations. Dean organized a team to secure temporary shelter for Pete's displaced livestock, while I joined the effort to salvage what little could be recovered from the barn's periphery. By mid-morning, the fire was fully extinguished, leaving behind a charred skeleton of what had been one of the county's oldest agricultural structures. Pete stood amidst the ruins, suddenly looking every day of his 77 years. "Had that barn since '49, he said quietly as I joined him. "Survived 3 tornadoes and a straight-line wind that took down half the trees in the county. Now it's gone in a single night. We'll help you rebuild, Pete. Everyone will." He nodded absently, his gaze fixed on something in the smoldering debris. Carefully navigating through the wreckage, he retrieved a blackened metal object, the bell that had hung in the barn's cupola since his father's time. "Some things survive," he murmured, cradling the bell like a wounded animal. "Not many, but some." The fire chief approached, clipboard in hand, his expression guarded. "Mr. Johnson, we've completed our preliminary investigation. I'm afraid I need to revise my earlier assessment. This doesn't appear to have been an electrical fire." Pete looked up sharply. "What do you mean?" "We found evidence of an accelerant, diesel fuel most likely. This fire was deliberately set." The words fell like stones in still water, sending ripples of shock through everyone within hearing distance. Arson was almost unheard of in our close-knit farming community. "Who would do such a thing?" Martha Johnson asked, her voice trembling with age and emotion. The fire chief shook his head. "That's for the sheriff to determine. He's on his way now." Dean caught my eye across the charred timbers, his expression unreadable. Without a word, he turned and walked toward the road where Harrington's black Lincoln was parked, the corporate representative observing the scene from a respectful distance. I followed, anger building with each step. The timing was too convenient to be coincidence. Pete's barn burns the night after he publicly supports our stance against agri-grow. Harrington saw us approaching and stepped out of his vehicle, his expression appropriately somber. "Terrible tragedy," he remarked. "I understand this was one of the historic structures in the county." "Cut the act," Dean said, his voice low and dangerous. "We know what this is." Harrington's practiced professional mask didn't slip. "I'm afraid I don't follow you, Mr. Thompson." "A warning," I clarified. "Subtle as a heart attack. The night after Pete Johnson supports our position against your company, his barn mysteriously burns down." Now Harrington's expression changed genuine surprise, replacing corporate blandness. You think Agrigro had something to do with this? That's an extremely serious accusation, Mr. Thompson. One that could have legal consequences if voiced publicly. Well, just like opposing your company seems to have consequences, Dean replied. Tell your bosses the message was received, but if anything like this happens again, we'll make sure every farmer and every newspaper in the Midwest knows exactly what kind of business Agrigro really is. Harrington's surprise gave way to something harder, more genuine than his previous corporate persona. Let me be perfectly clear, Mr. Thompson. Agrigro is a publicly traded company with a spotless ethical record. We don't engage in intimidation tactics. We don't need to. Time and economics are on our side. He gestured toward the gathered community, helping Pete salvage what he could. This way of life is dying a natural death. Small farms can't compete with modern agribusiness. Your grandfather's techniques might delay the inevitable for some, but they can't stop it. The smart play is to secure your future before there's nothing left to salvage. The cold calculation in his assessment was more chilling than any threat could have been. The offer stands until tomorrow at noon, he continued, checking his gold watch. After that, Agrigro will pursue other avenues to develop similar technologies. And believe me, they exist. He returned to his car without another word, leaving Dean and me standing in the muddy farm lane as the Lincoln pulled away. You still think selling to them is a good idea? I asked quietly. Dean's expression was troubled. I think they're more dangerous than I realized, and I think we need to be very careful about our next move. Sheriff Dawson arrived 30 minutes later, his patrol car crunching over the gravel driveway to park beside the fire trucks. A career lawman in his early 60s, Dawson had served the county for over 3 decades and had known Grandpa since high school. His investigation was thorough but ultimately inconclusive. The accelerant had been common diesel fuel available at any farm or gas station. There were no witnesses, no unusual tire tracks, no obvious suspects. In a community where most barns contain similar equipment and supplies, there wasn't even a clear motive beyond malice or random vandalism. I'll keep investigating, Dawson promised Pete as he prepared to leave. But without more evidence, this may be a tough one to solve. As the emergency vehicles departed and the neighbors began to disperse, promising to return with building materials and labor to start the reconstruction, Pete drew Dean and me aside. This wasn't random, he said quietly, and it wasn't local troublemakers. This happened because I stood with you boys against Agrigro. We don't know that for certain, I cautioned, though I shared his suspicion. I've lived too long to believe in coincidences this convenient, Pete replied. That corporate fellow, Harrington, was watching the whole time. Not helping, not offering condolences like the neighbors. Just watching like he was assessing the effectiveness of a demonstration. Dean's face darkened. If they're behind this, they've crossed a line. We need to be prepared for what might come next. Pete nodded grimly. Farmers have been standing up to powerful interests since this country was founded. We didn't back down then, and we won't now. His determination was inspiring. But as we drove back to our farm to prepare for the court hearing, the reality of what we were facing settled heavily upon us. Agrigro wasn't some faceless government agency or distant corporate entity. They had representatives on the ground, local connections, and apparently the will to use intimidation tactics if conventional business methods failed. We need to call Dr. Wilson, I said as we approached the farmhouse. Tell her what happened and move up the timeline for transferring Grandpa's research to the university. The sooner it's protected, the better. Dean nodded, his earlier advocacy for Agrigro's offer noticeably absent. The courthouse in town dated back to 1896, a limestone monument to Midwestern civic pride that had witnessed the legal affairs of 5 generations of county residents. The probate courtroom on the second floor maintained its original oak benches and judge's dais, though modern fluorescent lighting had replaced the original gas fixtures. Judge Eleanor Brannon had been presiding over probate matters for 23 years. At 70, she had the no-nonsense demeanor of someone who had heard every possible inheritance dispute and family squabble the county could produce. Richardson had prepared us for the hearing, explaining that while this was a serious matter involving fraud, the judge's primary concern would be determining the validity of the competing wills and ensuring proper disposition of the estate. The criminal aspect, the forgery, is a separate matter that would normally be referred to the district attorney, he explained as we waited for our case to be called. But given your agreement to resolve this within the family, and assuming Dean cooperates fully, we should be able to focus solely on validating the authentic will. Dean sat beside me in an uncomfortable silence, his attention focused on the courtroom door, as if expecting someone to enter at any moment. When our case was finally called, we approached the bench with Richardson standing side by side despite the chasm of broken trust between us. Judge Brannon reviewed the documents before her occasionally glancing up to study our faces. Mr. Richardson, this is an unusual situation. You're presenting evidence that a will you previously submitted to this court was fraudulent and that you were misled by one of your clients. Richardson nodded gravely. That is correct, Your Honor. I accepted the document in good faith, believing it had been properly executed by Richard Thompson. New evidence has come to light indicating otherwise. The judge turned her attention to Dean. Mr. Thompson, these are serious allegations. Do you contest them? Dean cleared his throat, his farmer's hands looking out of place against the polished oak railing. No, Your Honor. I acknowledge that I presented a fraudulent will and misled both my brother and Mr. Richardson. Judge Brannon's expression remained neutral, but her tone sharpened. You understand that will fraud is a criminal offense that can result in significant penalties, including imprisonment? Yes, Your Honor. And yet you're appearing here voluntarily to admit to this fraud. Yes, Your Honor. I want to correct my mistake and honor my grandfather's true wishes. The judge turned to me. Mr. Thompson, Jack, you're aware of your right to pursue criminal charges in this matter. I am, Your Honor. But I believe resolving this within the family, according to my grandfather's authentic will, better serves his legacy than a criminal prosecution of my brother. Judge Brannon studied us both for a long moment before returning her attention to the documents. The authentic will appears properly executed with appropriate witnesses and notarization. It clearly expresses Richard Thompson's intention to divide his estate equally between his grandsons, with specific provisions regarding his agricultural research. She removed her reading glasses, fixing Dean with a stern gaze. Mr. Thompson, while this court respects the family's desire to resolve this matter privately, I want to be absolutely clear about the seriousness of your actions. Will fraud undermines the entire probate system and the right of individuals to determine the disposition of their assets after death. Under different circumstances, I would not hesitate to refer this matter to the district attorney. Dean nodded, appropriately contrite. I understand, Your Honor. Very well. Based on the evidence presented, I am setting aside the previously submitted will as fraudulent and recognizing this document as the authentic last will and testament of Richard Thompson. The estate shall be distributed according to its provisions with equal shares to both grandsons in the specified handling of the agricultural research materials. She signed the order with a flourish, then fixed us both with a final admonishment. Gentlemen, family farms represent one of the oldest and most important traditions in this state. Your grandfather built a legacy worthy of respect and preservation. I suggest you both remember that as you move forward from this unfortunate situation. With a tap of her gavel, our case was concluded. The Thompson farm was officially divided equally between Dean and me, with Grandpa's research designated for the University Agricultural Cooperative, as he had intended. As we left the courthouse, Richardson shook our hands with the formal dignity of the old-school country lawyer he was. Justice has been done, though, not without cost to your family's trust. I wish you both wisdom in rebuilding what has been damaged. Dean and I walked to our vehicles in silence, the legal victory overshadowed by the morning's arson at Pete's farm and the looming deadline from AgriGrow. The corporate offer expired at noon tomorrow, less than 24 hours away. What are you going to do? I asked as we reached the parking lot. Dean looked toward the western horizon where storm clouds were gathering again. I don't know yet. This morning I was ready to tell Harrington to go to hell, but after seeing what happened to Pete, he trailed off, leaving the implication hanging between us. We can't let intimidation dictate our decisions. That's not what Grandpa would have done. Grandpa didn't live to see his barn burned down, Dean replied grimly. We drove back to the farm separately, each lost in private thoughts about the choices before us. The university team had returned during our absence, continuing their documentation of Grandpa's research under Dr. Wilson's supervision. I found her in the hidden laboratory, carefully photographing pages from one of the older journals. The court recognized Grandpa's authentic will, I reported. His research is officially designated for the university cooperative just as he wanted. She smiled genuine pleasure, lighting her academic features. That's excellent news, Jack. We've made significant progress today. Dr. Chen has confirmed that the soil enhancement techniques work exactly as your grandfather documented. The results are remarkable. Drought resistance increased by up to 60% without chemical additives that might harm the ecosystem. What about the patent applications? Professor McAllister is drafting them now. We should have preliminary protection in place by tomorrow afternoon. The timing was tight, after AgriGrow's deadline but before any potential legal challenges could be mounted. There's something else you should know, I said, lowering my voice despite the empty farmhouse. Pete Johnson's barn burned down last night. Arson, diesel accelerant. Dr. Wilson's expression shifted from academic enthusiasm to grave concern. You think it's connected to AgriGrow's interest in the research? The timing is suspicious. Pete was one of our most vocal supporters yesterday when Harrington visited. She set down the journal she'd been examining, suddenly looking older and wearier. Corporate agriculture plays hardball. Jack, I've seen it before with other innovations that threaten their business model. If they can't buy the technology, they'll try to suppress it or discredit it. What should we do? Accelerate everything. I'll call the university now and arrange for security personnel to help transport all research materials to campus tonight, not tomorrow as planned. The sooner we have everything in secure storage with documented chain of custody, the better. Her urgency was infectious. Within an hour, plans were in place to move all of Grandpa's journals, soil samples, and experimental documentation to the university's agricultural science building under the protection of campus security. Dean watched these preparations with obvious concern, his earlier cooperation replaced by growing anxiety. You're making a mistake, Jack. Moving everything to the university just makes it a bigger target. It will be more secure there than here. Against what legal challenges maybe. But if AgriGrow is willing to burn down a barn to send a message, what might they do to a university building full of research they want to suppress? The suggestion was chilling, but I refused to let fear dictate our actions. The university has proper security surveillance systems, fireproof storage. It's the right move, Dean. He shook his head, unconvinced. I hope you're right, for all our sakes. As evening approached, a university van arrived to transport the materials. 2 security officers helped load the carefully packaged journals, soil samples, and documentation, while Dr. Wilson supervised to ensure nothing was overlooked. Dean watched from the park, his expression unreadable, as the physical evidence of Grandpa's life's work was removed from the farm that had been its birthplace. It feels wrong, he said as I joined him, like we're erasing him from this place. We're protecting his legacy, not erasing it. Once everything is properly documented and secured, we can implement his techniques here on the farm, just as he would have wanted. Dean didn't respond, his attention fixed on the departing university van as it disappeared down the long driveway. We ate dinner in strained silence, the old farmhouse feeling emptier without the activity of the university team and the physical presence of Grandpa's research materials. The grandfather clock in the living room, a wedding gift to our grandparents in 1936, ticked away the hours toward AgriGrow's deadline with mechanical indifference to our dilemma. I'm going to check on Pete, Dean announced after we'd cleared the dishes, see if he needs any help securing his property for the night. I'll come with you. He shook his head. Someone should stay here. After what happened at Pete's, we shouldn't leave the farm unattended. The logic was sound, but something in his tone raised my suspicions. You're not meeting with Harrington, are you? Dean's expression hardened. Is that what you think of me now? That after everything today, the court hearing, Pete's barn, all of it, I'd still be sneaking around with AgriGrow? His indignation seemed genuine, making me question my own suspicion. I'm sorry, it's just been a day of surprises, not all of them pleasant. He nodded, accepting the apology without further comment. I won't be long, just want to make sure Pete's got everything he needs for the night. After Dean left, I walked the property as the sun began to set, retracing the paths Grandpa had taken during his evening inspections for as long as I could remember. The farm looked the same as always. The white farmhouse, the red barn, the fields ready for harvest. But everything had changed in ways visible only to those who understood what had been lost and what remained at risk. In the fading light, I found myself drawn to the southwest corner of the property, where the fence post had concealed Grandpa's final message. The post still stood, now empty of its secret contents, but no less significant as the physical embodiment of his foresight and caution. As I examined it in the gathering dusk, something caught my eye. A small marking on the side facing away from the main property, visible only from this angle. 3 notches cut into the wood, deliberate and precise. Grandpa had been a methodical man who did nothing without purpose. These notches meant something. Looking more carefully at the fence line stretching in both directions, I noticed that certain posts bore similar markings. Not all of them, but perhaps one in every 6 or 7. Moving to the next marked post, I examined it closely in the fading light, running my fingers along the weathered wood. Unlike the corner post, this one didn't have a removable cap, but the wood felt different near the base. Newer, less weathered. With growing excitement, I knelt in the damp soil, digging around the post with my bare hands until I felt something hard and smooth beneath the surface. Metal. A small waterproof container had been buried beside the post, just deep enough to be hidden but accessible to someone who knew where to look. Inside was another sealed packet containing what appeared to be seed samples in a small notebook with planting instructions. Moving systematically along the fence line, I checked each marked post, finding similar containers buried near 5 of them, before darkness made further exploration impossible. Each contained different seed varieties with accompanying notes in Grandpa's handwriting, describing their characteristics and optimal growing conditions. This was more than just documentation. It was a living seed bank of Grandpa's most successful experimental crops preserved in multiple locations across the property as a backup to his written records. I gathered the containers in a burlap sack from the barn, my mind racing with the implications of this discovery. Grandpa hadn't just recorded his research in journals. He had preserved the physical results in a distributed network across the farm, ensuring that even if his written work was lost or destroyed, the actual seeds would survive. The sound of a vehicle approaching drew my attention back to the house. Dean's truck pulled into the driveway, followed by another vehicle, not Harrington's Lincoln, but a modest sedan I didn't recognize. Carrying my discoveries, I hurried back to the house, arriving just as Dean and his companion entered through the kitchen door. The stranger was an older man, perhaps in his 70s, with the weathered complexion and calloused hands of someone who had spent a lifetime working outdoors. "Jack, this is William Farrell." Dean introduced us. He worked with Grandpa at the Department of Agriculture back in the early 50s. Farrell extended his hand, his grip still firm despite his age. "Richard and I were part of the same research team developing drought-resistant wheat varieties," he explained. "We lost touch after he left the department, but I followed his career from a distance. He was one of the finest agricultural minds I ever encountered." The unexpected appearance of someone from Grandpa's past, especially his scientific past, was both surprising and fortuitous. "How did you find Mr. Farrell?" I asked Dean. "Pete Johnson mentioned him this evening. Said Grandpa had corresponded with him occasionally over the years. Mr. Farrell still lives about an hour north of here." Farrell glanced at the burlap sack I'd set on the kitchen table. "What have you got there, son?" I explained my discovery of the marked fence posts and the buried seed samples, watching as Farrell's expression shifted from polite interest to genuine excitement. "That's Richard, all right. Always thinking ahead, always having a backup plan." He examined one of the seed packets with the reverence of someone handling a rare manuscript. "These aren't just experimental varieties. They're the culmination of decades of selective breeding. Priceless genetic material." Dean looked stunned. "You mean there's more valuable research buried all over the farm?" Farrell nodded carefully, returning the seeds to their waterproof container. "Richard was conducting the work we started at the department, but couldn't continue due to budget cuts and shifting priorities. He understood that real agricultural progress requires decades of patient observation and refinement, not quarterly profit reports." The older man's presence seemed to affect Dean profoundly. Here was someone who had known Grandpa during his scientific career, who understood the true significance of his life's work in a way that even we, his grandsons, had only begun to grasp. "Mr. Farrell, we're facing a situation." I explained, outlining the conflict with Agrigrow and their deadline the following day. "Any insight you could provide about the significance of Grandpa's work might help us make the right decision." Farrell settled into a kitchen chair, accepting the coffee Dean offered with a nod of thanks. "What Richard was doing here wasn't just good farming. It was essential research that the government abandoned prematurely. He was developing agricultural techniques that could help maintain food production during periods of extended drought or climate shifts. He sipped his coffee, gathering his thoughts before continuing. During our time at the department, we were part of a classified program examining agricultural security during the Cold War. The government was concerned about food production vulnerabilities in case of extended conflicts or environmental disruptions. This was new information. Grandpa's government work had been more significant than we'd realized. Why was it classified? Dean asked. It was just agricultural research. Because it had national security implications, Farrell explained. A country that can maintain food production under adverse conditions has a strategic advantage. Our team was developing techniques that would allow American farmers to maintain yields even if normal weather patterns were disrupted. The implications were clear. Grandpa's research wasn't just commercially valuable, it had potential strategic significance that went beyond corporate profits. When the immediate Cold War agricultural concerns shifted to other priorities, the program was defunded, Farrell continued. Several of us protested, arguing that the long-term research was too important to abandon, but bureaucratic minds had moved on to other threats. So Grandpa continued the work privately, I said, pieces falling into place. Farrell nodded. Richard was always the most dedicated among us. He had the perfect setup, a family farm where he could conduct long-term experiments without institutional oversight or pressure for immediate results. He kept me updated occasionally over the years, and what he accomplished was remarkable. Dean leaned forward, his expression troubled. If this research had national security implications in the 1950s, wouldn't it still be important today? Shouldn't the government be involved rather than a university agricultural program? Farrell considered the question carefully. The strategic landscape has changed. Today, the threat isn't just from foreign adversaries, but from climate instability and corporate consolidation of the food supply. Richard understood that. It's why he wanted his work to benefit individual farmers rather than government agencies or corporations that might restrict access. His assessment aligned perfectly with what we knew of Grandpa's intentions. But it also elevated the stakes of our conflict with agri-grow. This wasn't just about commercial agriculture, but potentially about food security on a broader scale. Agri-grow's deadline is noon tomorrow, I reminded Dean. We need to decide our response tonight. Farrell's presence had changed the dynamic between us. Dean seemed less defensive, more thoughtful as he considered our options. Mr. Farrell, what would you do in our position? He asked. The older man set down his coffee cup, his expression grave. I'd honor Richard's wishes. He understood the long game in agriculture better than almost anyone. If he wanted his research shared through university cooperatives rather than commercialized by corporations, he had good reasons. Dean nodded slowly, something resolving in his expression. Then that's what we'll do. We'll reject AgriGrow's offer and proceed with the university partnership. His declaration should have brought relief, but instead I felt a nagging unease. Dean's change of heart seemed too sudden, too complete, after days of advocating for AgriGrow's offer. What about the potential repercussions, I asked. Pete's barn, the implied threats. We'll face those together, Dean replied with newfound determination. This farm has weathered worse than corporate intimidation. Farrell observed our exchange with the quiet assessment of someone who had seen many family conflicts in his long career. Richard would be proud to see you boys standing together on this, he remarked. He always said the true value of the farm wasn't in the land or the crops, but in what it taught about responsibility and stewardship. The conversation continued late into the evening, with Farrell sharing stories about Grandpa's early scientific career and the groundbreaking work their team had pursued. Dean offered him the guest room for the night, which he accepted gratefully, citing the late hour and the long drive home. After Farrell retired, Dean and I sat at the kitchen table, the grandfather clock ticking steadily in the background. I'm sorry, Jack, he said suddenly. For all of it, the forged will, the deception, the AgriGrow negotiations. I lost sight of what really matters. The apology seemed sincere, but something still felt off. A subtle tension in his posture, a guardedness in his eyes that suggested not everything was being said. What changed your mind? I asked directly. He hesitated, choosing his words carefully. Seeing Pete's barn burn, hearing Mr. Farrell talk about Grandpa's work and its importance, realizing that some things are worth more than money. All valid reasons, yet the nagging sense of something withheld persisted. I'm glad we're finally aligned on this, I said, watching his reaction closely. Tomorrow we'll call Harrington together and decline their offer. I'll make the call, Dean offered quickly, too quickly. It was my mistake getting involved with them in the first place. I should be the one to end it. Warning bells sounded in my mind. We'll do it together, I insisted, as partners in Grandpa's legacy. A flicker of something, frustration, concern, crossed Dean's face before he nodded agreement. As partners then. First thing tomorrow. We retired to our respective bedrooms, the old farmhouse settling around us with familiar creaks and sighs. Sleep eluded me as I considered the day's revelations. The arson at Pete's farm, the seed samples hidden across our property, the connection between Grandpa's research and Cold War agricultural security concerns. Something still didn't add up about Dean's sudden conversion from agri-grow advocate to university supporter. His change of heart seemed genuine when Farrell was present, but our private conversation afterward had left me unsettled. Restless, I rose and moved to the window looking out over the moonlit farm. A light rain had begun to fall again, silvering the roof of the barn and creating shifting patterns across the yard. A movement caught my eye, a figure crossing from the house to the barn, moving with purpose despite the rain. Dean. What was he doing in the barn I checked the bedside clock. 1:17 in the morning, pulling on boots and a jacket. I slipped downstairs and out the side door, staying close to the shadows as I approached the barn. A flashlight beam moved inside, visible through the windows, as Dean searched for something among the equipment and storage areas. The barn door was slightly ajar, allowing me to slip inside unnoticed. Dean was at the far end, using his flashlight to examine something on Grandpa's workbench, a metal box I hadn't seen before. "What are you doing, Dean?" He startled, dropping the flashlight, which rolled across the concrete floor, its beam creating wild shadows before coming to rest against a feed bag. "Jesus, Jack, you scared the hell out of me." "That doesn't answer my question." He retrieved the flashlight, directing its beam away from both our faces. "I couldn't sleep. Thought I'd check something Grandpa mentioned once, about keeping important documents in the barn rather than the house. Fire safety, he said." The explanation was plausible. Grandpa had indeed been concerned about fire hazards, especially after the Johnsons lost their first home to an electrical fire in the 1960s. But Dean's furtive behavior suggested something more than casual midnight curiosity. "What's in the box?" He hesitated, then sighed in resignation. "See for yourself." He handed me the metal container, an old ammunition box converted to storage, its military stenciling still partially visible beneath a coat of barn red paint. Inside were photographs, letters, and a small leather-bound book that looked like a personal diary rather than Grandpa's research journals. The top photograph showed a much younger Grandpa in what appeared to be a laboratory setting surrounded by men in military uniforms as well as civilians in white coats. The insignia visible on the uniforms wasn't familiar to me, but the setting was clearly more sophisticated than the Department of Agriculture facilities Farrell had described. "What is this?" I asked, examining the image more closely. "I don't know exactly," Dean admitted. "Found it last year when I was replacing some rotted floorboards under the workbench. Grandpa never mentioned it, and I didn't ask. Figured if he wanted it hidden, he had his reasons." The diary contained entries dating from 1944 through 1946, earlier than Grandpa's time at the Department of Agriculture. The handwriting was unmistakably his, but the content was cryptic, filled with code names and abbreviations that meant nothing to me. One entry from October 1945 caught my attention. "Project Harvest Moon terminated officially today. All materials transferred to domestic agencies. Team dispersing to civilian roles with appropriate cover stories. My assignment, Department of Agriculture Plant Sciences Division. Continuation parameters established for Phase 2 monitoring. Initial soil samples secured for baseline comparison." The language was nothing like Grandpa's usual straightforward farmer's journal entries. This was the writing of someone involved in classified government work, using terminology designed to obscure rather than clarify. "Have you shown this to anyone?" I asked, a new understanding of Grandpa's past beginning to take shape. Dean shook his head. "Didn't seem right. Whatever this was, Grandpa kept it hidden for a reason." I continued reading, finding entries that hinted at a much more complex history than we'd known. March 1946, first test plots established on northern acreage. Control samples maintained per protocol. Monitoring schedule implemented with regular reporting through established channels. Cover story accepted without question in local community. And later, December 1946, Phase 2 formally downgraded to monitoring status only. No further active development authorized. Decision made to continue private research without official sanction. Some risks involved, but the work is too important to abandon. The implications were staggering. Grandpa hadn't just been an agricultural scientist with the Department of Agriculture. He had been involved in something more classified, something that predated his civilian role, and continued privately after official support was withdrawn. Jack, Dean said quietly, breaking my absorption in the diary, "There's something else you should see." He reached into his jacket pocket and produced a folded document. Not the agri-grow offer I had expected, but something that appeared to be decades old, the paper yellowed with age. Found this pressed between the pages of the diary. It's some kind of official termination notice. The document bore a government letterhead I didn't recognize, with most identifying information redacted by heavy black lines. The text that remained was bureaucratically sparse. Project Harvest Moon, termination of civilian consultant status, effective of October 15, 1945. Your services as civilian consultant to Project Harvest Moon are hereby terminated. All materials, notes, and research products developed during your service remain classified under national security protocols. Disclosure of any aspect of your work is strictly prohibited. Your transition to civilian status with the Department of Agriculture has been arranged as discussed. Ongoing monitoring responsibilities are outlined in separate documentation. On behalf of the United States government, we extend appreciation for your service during this critical period. The signature at the bottom had been redacted, but a military rank was partially visible. Colonel something. This isn't just agricultural research, I said, the pieces falling into place. Grandpa was involved in some kind of classified military project during the war. Dean nodded slowly. That would explain why he kept his most important work hidden, why he was so paranoid about government or corporate interference. Whatever he was doing here, it started as something much bigger. The midnight discovery cast everything we thought we knew about Grandpa's research in a new light. His techniques weren't just the work of a gifted farmer scientist continuing abandoned Department of Agriculture research. They were the civilian evolution of something that had begun under military auspices during World War II. We need to talk to Farrell, I said, replacing the materials in the metal box. He might know more about this Project Harvest Moon. If it was classified, he might not be able to discuss it, Dean pointed out. Or he might not have been part of it at all. The Department of Agriculture work came after this military project. As if summoned by our conversation, a figure appeared in the barn doorway. Farrell, fully dressed despite the late hour, his expression grave in the flashlight's reflected glow. I heard voices and saw the light, he explained, stepping inside. Trouble sleeping seems to be going around tonight. Dean and I exchanged glances, silently debating how much to share with our unexpected visitor. The decision was made for us when Farrell's gaze fell on the metal box and recognition flashed across his weathered features. I see you found Richard's insurance policy, he said quietly. I wondered if he'd left any record of the original project. Dawn broke over the Thompson farm with the muted colors of an overcast autumn morning. The rain had stopped sometime during the night, leaving behind puddles that reflected the gray sky like scattered mirrors across the farmyard. In the kitchen, coffee percolated on the stove as William Farrell sat at the table. The metal box opened before him, its contents carefully arranged in chronological order. Project Harvest Moon was never meant to be public knowledge. Even after all these years, I'm probably violating half a dozen security oaths by discussing it. But Richard's work is too important to remain hidden now, especially with agri-grow circling like vultures. Farrell picked up the photograph of Grandpa in the laboratory, handling it with reverent care. This was taken at Los Alamos in 1910. Your grandfather was part of a small agricultural team attached to the Manhattan Project. The revelation hung in the air like smoke. The Manhattan Project, the top-secret government program that developed the atomic bomb during World War II. What did farming have to do with nuclear weapons? Everything. The military planners weren't just thinking about winning the war. They were thinking about what came after, particularly the effects of radiation on food production. Project Harvest Moon was tasked with developing agricultural techniques that could restore productivity to contaminated soil. Dean poured coffee for all of us, his hands steady despite the weight of what we were learning. Are you saying Grandpa's soil enhancement techniques came from nuclear research? Farrell shook his head. Not directly, no. The initial focus was on soil remediation after radiation exposure, but the research evolved. Richard and a few others recognized that the same principles could be applied to drought resistance and general soil enhancement without any connection to radiation. That's when the project really found its purpose. He sipped his coffee, organizing his thoughts before continuing. By 1945, with the war ending, military interest in the agricultural applications waned. The project was officially terminated, but several key scientists, including Richard, believed the work was too valuable to abandon. They arranged transfers to civilian agencies, in Richard's case, the Department of Agriculture, where they could continue aspects of the research under non-classified auspices. And that's where you met him, I said, connecting the timeline with what Farrell had told us earlier. Yes, by then Project Harvest Moon was officially defunct, but its core insights lived on in our department's drought resistance research. When those programs were later cut due to budget constraints, Richard made the decision to continue privately. Farrell gestured to the diary entries. What made Richard's approach unique was his long-term perspective. While most agricultural research follows funding cycles of 3 to 5 years, he understood that meaningful soil development requires decades of consistent application and monitoring. He turned this farm into the longest-running agricultural experiment in the country, possibly the world. The grandfather clock in the living room chimed 6 times, marking the early hour, and reminding us that AgriGrow's deadline was approaching. Dean rose to refill our coffee cups, his expression troubled. If Grandpa's research originated in a classified military project, doesn't that complicate our legal position? Could the government claim ownership? Farrell considered the question carefully. Technically, the original Project Harvest Moon materials remain government property, but Richard's subsequent innovations, developed over decades on private land with private resources, belong to his estate. The techniques he perfected here went far beyond the initial government research. Does AgriGrow know about this connection? I asked the question that had been forming since our midnight discovery. Farrell's expression darkened. That's what concerns me. Agricultural corporations maintain extensive intelligence networks. If they've identified the strategic value of Richard's work, their interest goes beyond commercial applications. Control of drought-resistant agricultural techniques has geopolitical implications in a world increasingly affected by climate instability. The kitchen fell silent as we absorbed the implications. This wasn't just about inheritance or family legacy anymore. Grandpa's quiet, methodical research on our modest Iowa farm had potentially global significance. What should we do? Dean asked the question directed at both of us. Proceed with the university partnership as planned, I said firmly. It's what Grandpa wanted, and it's the best way to ensure his techniques benefit farmers rather than corporate interests. I agree, Farrell added, but we should move quickly. The sooner Richard's complete methodology is documented and secured by the university, the harder it will be for anyone, corporation or government, to suppress or control it. Dean nodded, his earlier ambivalence apparently resolved. I'll call Harrington at 9 o'clock, decline their offer, and make it clear we're proceeding with the university partnership. We spent the next 2 hours reviewing Grandpa's diary entries with Farrell, who provided context for the cryptic references and code names. The full picture that emerged was of a man who had started as a government scientist, but evolved into something more principled. A researcher who understood the moral dimensions of his work and chose the path of greatest public benefit rather than personal profit. At 8:30, Dr. Wilson called to report that all the research materials had arrived safely at the university and were being processed in secure facilities. The patent applications were proceeding with preliminary protections expected by afternoon. We've also arranged a meeting with the state agricultural commissioner this afternoon, she added. Once he understands the significance of Richard's work, we can secure additional protection through the state's agricultural preservation programs. Everything was proceeding according to plan, yet a sense of foreboding lingered. Pete's burned barn stood as a stark reminder that not everyone respected legal processes and university partnerships. At precisely 9 o'clock, Dean placed the call to Edward Harrington. The conversation was brief and professional, with Dean firmly declining AgriGrow's offer and informing Harrington that the Thompson family was proceeding with the university partnership as specified in Grandpa's authentic will. "He took it better than I expected," Dean reported after hanging up. "Very corporate. Thanked me for the consideration, said they respected our decision, and hoped we might find opportunities to work together in the future." "Too easy," Farrell remarked, voicing the concern we all felt. "Corporations like AgriGrow don't invest time and resources in acquisitions only to walk away quietly when rejected. Maybe they recognized the legal obstacles were too great," I suggested without much conviction. "Or they're shifting to a different approach," Dean countered, glancing toward the window as a vehicle turned into our driveway. Not Harrington's Lincoln, but an official-looking black SUV with government plates. Two men in dark suits emerged, walking with the purposeful stride of federal agents. They approached the front door and knocked with formal authority. Farrell's face paled. "This is exactly what I was afraid of." Dean answered the door, greeting the visitors with cautious courtesy. They presented credentials identifying themselves as agents from a Department of Agriculture Security Division, a department none of us had heard of before. "Mr. Thompson, I'm Agent Calloway, and this is Agent Mendez. We need to speak with you regarding certain agricultural research conducted on this property." They entered with the confident entitlement of federal officials, their attention immediately focusing on Farrell when they entered the kitchen. "Dr. Farrell, it's been a long time. I believe the last security briefing you attended was in 1987. Farrell acknowledged the reference with a tight nod, his earlier openness replaced by guarded formality. "Agents, may I ask what brings the department to the Thompson farm today?" Agent Calloway, the older of the two with silver hair and the weathered complexion of someone who had spent years in the field before moving to administrative roles, took the lead. "We've received information regarding potentially restricted research materials developed under Project Harvest Moon. As you're aware, Dr. Farrell, those materials remain classified under national security protocols." "Project Harvest Moon was terminated in 1945, Farrell replied evenly. "Any subsequent research conducted by Richard Thompson was developed independently as a private citizen." Agent Mendez, younger and more overtly aggressive, interjected. "Our information suggests otherwise. We have reason to believe that classified methodologies were continued and expanded upon without authorization. Those derivatives remain government property under the original security provisions." The implication was clear. They were claiming Grandpa's life's work for the government based on its distant connection to a classified wartime project. "That's absurd," I protested. "My grandfather spent 60 years developing these techniques independently on private property with private resources. The foundational methodologies originated in classified research," Calloway stated with bureaucratic certainty. "Subsequent developments represent derivatives of restricted materials." Dean's expression hardened. "You've never shown any interest in his work before. Why now, just as we're preparing to share it through the University Agricultural Cooperative?" A moment of uncomfortable silence followed as the agents exchanged glances. "We're simply enforcing long-standing security protocols," Calloway replied, the practiced answer revealing nothing. Farrell's eyes narrowed with sudden understanding. "You're not here on your own initiative. Someone alerted you to the situation. Someone with knowledge of Project Harvest Moon and its connection to Richard's current research." Mendez maintained a professional poker face, but Calloway's slight shift in posture suggested Farrell had hit the mark. "We're not at liberty to discuss our sources." "It was AgriGrow, wasn't it?" Dean pressed. "They reached out to you after we declined their offer this morning." Again, no direct confirmation, but the agent's carefully neutral expressions told us all we needed to know. AgriGrow had taken their rejection and immediately escalated to federal intervention. "We have a court order authorizing us to secure all research materials derived from Project Harvest Moon," Calloway announced, producing an official document. "We'll need access to any remaining records, samples, or documentation on the property. The university already has most of the materials." I informed them, feeling a small sense of victory, that we'd moved quickly enough to forestall complete government appropriation. "We're aware," Mendez replied coolly. "Colleagues are currently at the University Agricultural Building with a similar order. But we understand from our sources that Richard Thompson maintained multiple copies of his research in various locations across his property. The seed samples. They knew about the hidden caches along the fence line. This is wrong, Farrell said, his voice carrying the moral authority of his age and experience. What Richard developed here goes far beyond anything in Project Harvest Moon. The government abandoned that research. He carried it forward as a private citizen at his own expense for the benefit of ordinary farmers. That's not for us to determine, Dr. Farrell, Calloway replied. Our job is to secure potentially classified materials. The appropriate review boards will make final determinations regarding ownership and distribution. The bureaucratic response carried an implicit threat. Once the government took possession of Grandpa's research, it could disappear into review committees and security classifications for years, perhaps decades. We have a right to appeal this order, I stated, reaching for the document Calloway had presented. Of course, he acknowledged, but the materials will remain in government custody during any appeal process. Dean had been unusually quiet during this exchange, his attention focused on something outside the kitchen window. Now he spoke with sudden urgency. Jack, we have visitors. Beyond the agent's vehicle, a familiar black Lincoln had pulled into our driveway, followed by two AgriGrow corporate SUVs. Edward Harrington emerged from the Lincoln, accompanied by several men who moved with the disciplined coordination of private security personnel. Your sources appear to be providing real-time updates, Farrell observed dryly to the agents. Calloway's professional mask slipped, slightly revealing a flash of annoyance. AgriGrow has no official connection to this operation. Yet they arrived minutes after you with a full security team, Dean noted. Quite a coincidence. Harrington approached the house with confident strides, his corporate smile firmly in place as Dean opened the door. Mr. Thompson, I received your decision this morning and respect your choice. I'm merely here as an observer while the department completes its necessary security protocols. An observer with private security, I remarked, noting the positioning of his team around our property. Harrington's smile didn't waver. Standard corporate procedure when visiting remote locations. Nothing more. The convergence of government agents and corporate representatives created a surreal atmosphere in the farmhouse kitchen, where countless family meals had been shared over generations. Grandpa's quiet, methodical research had suddenly become the focus of powerful interests that seemed determined to control it by any means necessary. I'd like to see the court order, I said, extending my hand toward Agent Calloway. He provided the document, a complex legal directive filled with citations of national security statutes and agricultural regulatory provisions. As I scanned it, something caught my attention, a jurisdictional reference that seemed oddly specific. This order refers to materials developed under Project Harvest Moon and its direct derivatives. It doesn't cover independent research conducted after 1950. Calloway's expression remained neutral. The government's position is that all of Richard Thompson's agricultural innovations represent derivatives of the original classified research. That's factually and legally indefensible, Farrell interjected. Richard's most significant breakthroughs came decades after Project Harvest Moon, using entirely different methodologies. Again, that's for the review board to determine, Mendez replied. While this exchange continued, I noticed Dean slip outside ostensibly to monitor Harrington's security team, but moving with a purpose that suggested something more. Through the window, I saw him approach Pete Johnson's truck, which had just arrived at the far end of the driveway. The arrival of our elderly neighbor added another complication to the increasingly crowded scene. Pete emerged from his truck with the stiff movements of a man who had slept poorly after losing his barn, his weathered face registering confusion at the collection of government and corporate vehicles surrounding our farmhouse. Dean engaged him in brief conversation, then both men moved toward the equipment shed behind the barn, away from the watchful eyes of the agents and Harrington's security team. Perhaps we should all sit down and discuss this rationally, Harrington suggested, his corporate smoothness in full effect. AgriGrow has considerable experience navigating the intersection of agricultural innovation and government regulation. We might be able to facilitate a solution that satisfies all parties. The transparent attempt to position AgriGrow as a mediator after they had likely initiated the government intervention was almost laughable. Your assistance won't be necessary, Mr. Harrington, I replied. This matter concerns my grandfather's estate and the federal government. There's no role for AgriGrow in that discussion. Harrington's smile tightened fractionally. You misunderstand my offer, Mr. Thompson. AgriGrow has established relationships with the appropriate regulatory bodies. We could potentially expedite the review process, ensuring that valuable agricultural innovations reach the market without unnecessary delays. In exchange for what? Farrell asked bluntly. Exclusive commercial rights. Appropriate compensation to the Thompson estate naturally, Harrington replied smoothly, along with recognition of Richard Thompson's contributions. His name would be prominently featured in all commercial applications. The corporate doublespeak couldn't mask the essential truth. AgriGrow was using the government intervention as leverage to force the commercial arrangement we had already rejected. Before I could respond, a distant mechanical rumble drew everyone's attention. From behind the barn, a tractor emerged. Grandpa's beloved John Deere 4020 with Dean at the controls and Pete Johnson in the passenger seat. They were headed directly for the fence line where we had discovered the seed samples the previous evening. "What's happening over there?" Agent Mendez demanded, moving toward the door. "Routine farm work," I replied, blocking his path casually. "My brother has harvesting preparations to complete regardless of what's happening here." Calloway's eyes narrowed with suspicion. "During an active federal operation, the court order covers research materials, not farming equipment," I pointed out. "Unless you're suggesting the tractor contains classified technology." The weak attempt at humor fell flat, but it bought precious seconds as Dean and Pete reached the first marked fence post. Through the kitchen window, I could see them working quickly, Dean digging, while Pete kept watch. Harrington had also noticed the activity, his corporate mask slipping to reveal genuine alarm. "They're removing something from the ground," he reported, pulling out his phone and signaling to his security team. The agents moved toward the door, their earlier professional courtesy abandoned in the face of potential evidence removal. "Mr. Thompson interfering with a federal security operation is a serious offense," Calloway warned as he pushed past me. Outside, the situation was developing rapidly. Harrington's security team had spread out, moving to intercept Dean and Pete, while the tractor continued along the fence line at top speed. A modest pace for modern equipment, but impressive for the vintage John Deere trend. "We need to get out there," I urged Farrell, who nodded grimly. We followed the agents into the yard where the confrontation was escalating. Dean had reached the third marked fence post, quickly excavating the hidden container, while Pete stood guard, the dignity of his age and community, standing and creating a momentary buffer against intervention. "Federal agents, stop what you're doing immediately," Mendez called out, flashing his credentials. Dean ignored the command, tossing the container to Pete, who secured it in a canvas bag already containing several others. The tractor lurched forward toward the next marked post as Harrington's security team closed in from multiple directions. The scene was surreal. Federal agents and corporate security converging on an elderly farmer and his neighbor as they excavated seed samples from a fence line that had stood for generations. The morning sun broke through the clouds, momentarily illuminating the tableau in harsh clarity against the backdrop of fields ready for harvest. "This is official government business," Agent Calloway announced, reaching the tractor as Dean paused to dig at the fourth location. "Those materials are covered by our court order." Pete Johnson, 82 years of Midwestern stubbornness personified, stood his ground. "These are just seed samples from Richard's experimental plantings. Nothing to do with any government project." "That determination isn't yours to make, sir," Mendez replied, attempting to take the canvas bag. Pete pulled back, his dignity undiminished by the 30-year age difference between himself and the federal agent. "I've known Richard Thompson for 60 years, helped him plant some of these varieties myself. They're part of this farm's heritage, not government property." The standoff might have escalated further if not for the arrival of several vehicles turning into our driveway. University vans led by Dr. Wilson, followed by what appeared to be official state vehicles. The complexity of the situation increased as Dr. Wilson approached, accompanied by a distinguished man in a business suit who carried himself with the confident authority of a high-ranking official. "What's going on here?" Dr. Wilson demanded, surveying the scene with academic indignation. The man beside her stepped forward, addressing the federal agents directly. "I'm Howard Keller, Iowa State Agricultural Commissioner. My office received an urgent call regarding federal intervention at the Thompson farm. I'd like to see your authorization for this operation." Agent Calloway produced the court order, which Commissioner Keller examined with the practiced eye of someone familiar with legal documents. This order specifically references materials developed under a 1940s federal project. It doesn't cover subsequent independent research or agricultural specimens developed privately. The government's position is that all materials represent derivatives of classified research. Mendez maintained, though, with noticeably less confidence. Commissioner Keller handed back the document with a dismissive gesture. That's an exceptionally broad interpretation that wouldn't survive judicial review. More importantly, as of 9:30 this morning, the Thompson agricultural innovations have been designated as protected agricultural heritage assets under Iowa state law. He produced an official document bearing the state seal. This emergency designation was processed based on the university's application and my personal review of the research significance. It prevents removal of any related materials from the state without appropriate review and approval from my office. The legal countermove was unexpected and effective. The federal agents exchanged concerned glances, their confident authority undermined by this state-level intervention. Harrington stepped forward, corporate smoothness now tinged with visible frustration. Commissioner Keller AgriGrow has significant operations and investments in Iowa. We'd appreciate the opportunity to discuss this situation before any irreversible decisions are made. Keller regarded the corporate representative with the measured skepticism of an elected official who had witnessed many similar approaches. Mr. Harrington, isn't it? Your company's contributions to our state's economy are noted. However, this matter concerns the preservation of agricultural innovations developed by an Iowa farmer over 6 decades. The state has a compelling interest in ensuring these techniques benefit our agricultural community rather than becoming exclusive corporate property. The commissioner turned to address Dean and Pete, who had paused their fence line excavation during this exchange. Mr. Thompson, Mr. Johnson, please continue your work. The state of Iowa stands behind your right to preserve these agricultural materials. With this official backing, Dean and Pete resumed their recovery operation, continuing along the fence line to the remaining marked posts. Dr. Wilson dispatched university personnel to assist creating an orderly documentation process as each container was excavated. Agent Calloway, recognizing the shifting legal landscape, adopted a more conciliatory tone. Commissioner, we respect the state's interest in this matter. However, national security considerations must take precedence when classified research is involved. Of course, Keller acknowledged, which is why I've already spoken with the Secretary of Agriculture this morning. He's agreed that a joint federal-state review committee is the appropriate approach, with all materials remaining in Iowa during the assessment process. The diplomatic solution offered the federal agents a face-saving compromise while effectively neutralizing their immediate authority to remove Grandpa's research. Harrington, recognizing his leverage was evaporating, made one final attempt. Commissioner AgriGrow would be pleased to participate in this review process. Our technical expertise in agricultural innovations could prove valuable in assessing commercial applications. Your interest is noted, Mr. Harrington, Keller replied with the practiced politeness of someone accustomed to corporate lobbying. Any stakeholder consultations will be conducted according to established protocols. The bureaucratic dismissal was clear. AgriGrow had been relegated to the status of outside observer rather than privileged partner. As the confrontation de-escalated into procedural discussions between the commissioner and federal agents, I joined Dean and Pete at the final marked fence post. The canvas bag now contained samples from all the locations Grandpa had established across the property, a living seed bank preserving decades of careful breeding and selection. How did the commissioner get involved so quickly? I asked Dean as he carefully extracted the last container. Called Pete last night after our discussion with Farrell, Dean explained. Asked him to contact Commissioner Keller first thing this morning. Pete's son worked on Keller's campaign years ago. Said he'd take his call regardless of the hour. The strategic move revealed a side of Dean I hadn't fully appreciated. The practical farmer who understood local connections and relationships often carried more weight than corporate power or federal authority. You planned this as a contingency, I realized, even while discussing AgriGrow's offer. Dean nodded, a hint of the old defensive edge returning to his expression. I've been trying to tell you, Jack, I understand what we're up against. Corporations like AgriGrow don't just walk away when they want something. Neither does the federal government. We needed state-level protection as a buffer. His foresight had potentially saved Grandpa's legacy from disappearing into government classification or corporate patents. For the first time since discovering the forged will, I felt a genuine reconnection with my brother. Recognition that beneath his flawed decisions lay the same practical problem-solving approach Grandpa had valued. By mid-afternoon, the confrontation had transformed into an orderly documentation process. University personnel worked alongside state agricultural officials to catalog and preserve the seed samples, while the federal agents maintained a supervisory presence without direct intervention. Harrington and his agri-growth security team eventually departed corporate ambitions temporarily thwarted by the unexpected alliance of academic, state, and community interests. His parting words carried both professional courtesy and veiled determination. "This isn't over, Mr. Thompson. Agricultural innovation is a complex landscape with many paths to market. Agri-Grow remains interested in a mutually beneficial partnership when circumstances allow." The implied persistence might have been concerning if not for the protective framework now surrounding Grandpa's research. University documentation, state protection, and community awareness that would make further corporate or government appropriation attempts more difficult. As evening approached, the farmyard gradually emptied of officials and vehicles. Commissioner Keller departed with assurances of continued state support, while Dr. Wilson and her university team took responsibility for properly preserving and documenting the seed samples under the watchful eye of the federal agents, who would maintain nominal oversight until the Joint Review Committee was established. By sunset, only our core group remained. Dean Pete Farrell and myself gathered around the kitchen table where Grandpa had calculated crop rotations and equipment maintenance schedules for decades. "Richard would be proud," Pete observed, his weathered hands cradling a cup of coffee. "Not just of preserving his research, but of how you boys finally worked together." Dean glanced at me, something unspoken passing between us. Acknowledgement of the distance we'd traveled since the reading of the forged will. "We still have a lot to figure out," I admitted. "How to run the farm as partners, how to implement Grandpa's techniques properly, how to handle the legal complications that are bound to continue." "One day at a time," Pete advised with the simple wisdom of his years. "That's how your grandpa built all this. Not with grand plans, but with daily decisions, each building on the ones before." Farrell, who had remained to help explain the technical aspects of Grandpa's research to the various officials, added his perspective. "What matters most is that Richard's work will continue as he intended, benefiting ordinary farmers rather than corporate profit margins or government filing cabinets. The Joint Review Committee will eventually recognize what I've known for decades. His innovations represent one of the most significant contributions to sustainable agriculture in the past century." As darkness settled over the farm, Pete and Farrell departed with promises to return the following day. Dean and I found ourselves alone in the house that had shaped both our childhoods, now our shared responsibility and legacy. "There's something I need to show you," Dean said after a long silence. "Something I should have shared days ago." He retrieved an envelope from his bedroom. Not the Agri-Grow offer I had half expected, but a personal letter addressed to both of us in Grandpa's distinctive handwriting. "Found this in his Bible the day after he died," Dean explained. "Didn't show it to you because it complicated the narrative I was creating to justify what I was doing." The letter was dated just 3 weeks before Grandpa's death. "Dean and Jack, if you're reading this, I've moved on to whatever comes next. I've tried to prepare everything properly. The will, the research documentation, the seed repositories. But some things can only be said directly. Dean, your dedication to this land has been the foundation of everything we've accomplished. Your hands-on knowledge and daily perseverance have maintained the farm through challenges that would have defeated less determined men. But you've sometimes focused so much on survival that you've lost sight of why we do this work. Jack, your education and broader perspective bring exactly what this farm needs for the future. Your understanding of agricultural science can take my rudimentary experiments to levels I couldn't achieve. But knowledge without direct connection to the land risks becoming abstract and impractical. What I've tried to create here isn't just a farm or a research project. It's a model for a different approach to agriculture. One that respects natural processes while enhancing them, that produces abundance without depletion, that serves human needs without sacrificing future generations. Neither of you can carry this forward alone. Dean's practical experience and Jack's scientific understanding must work in partnership, balancing each other's strengths and compensating for each other's limitations. The research I've conducted here has value beyond what either of you might initially recognize. There will be pressure to commercialize it, to classify it, to control it in various ways. Resist these pressures. What matters isn't profit or recognition, but impact, helping ordinary farmers maintain productivity in increasingly challenging conditions. The university partnership outlined in my will represents the best path forward. Academic freedom combined with practical application through the agricultural cooperative. Trust this approach even when easier or more profitable alternatives present themselves. Remember that what appears valuable to corporations or governments is often what they can least be trusted to manage wisely. My work during the war taught me that technological power without moral guidance leads to destructive applications. Don't let my life's research become another tool for consolidating agricultural control in fewer hands. Most importantly, remember that you are brothers before you are business partners or research collaborators. The bond between you matters more than any material inheritance. Honor it, nurture it, and let it guide your decisions when conflicts arise. I'm proud of both of you, different as you are, each essential in your own way. Together, you represent everything I've worked toward. Trust each other's strengths, forgive each other's weaknesses, and carry forward the work that matters. With love and confidence, your grandfather. The simple wisdom of Grandpa's final message hung in the air between us. Acknowledgement of our differences alongside recognition of our complementary strengths. The letter revealed a deeper understanding of both our characters than either of us had recognized, along with foresight about the pressures his research would attract. He knew us better than we knew ourselves, Dean said quietly. Understood my resentment about staying while you left, your frustration at not being included in the daily operations. Why didn't you show me this sooner? Dean's expression reflected genuine regret. Because it contradicted everything I was trying to do with AgriGrow. Because it made my actions indefensible, even to myself. Because it showed that Grandpa never intended either of us to control everything alone. The admission represented a level of self-awareness I hadn't expected. Recognition of how personal insecurities had driven actions that betrayed Grandpa's trust. I was wrong, Jack. About the will, about AgriGrow, about keeping you at arm's length from the farm operations. All of it. I convinced myself I was protecting Grandpa's legacy, but I was really just protecting my position, my authority. The acknowledgement didn't erase the damage done, but it opened a path toward rebuilding the trust essential to the partnership Grandpa had envisioned. We both missed what he was trying to create, I admitted. I saw the research as separate from the farming, the scientific valuable, the practical secondary, but they were always integrated in his mind, each informing the other. Outside, a gentle rain began to fall, the rhythmic patter on the roof a familiar soundtrack to countless family conversations in this kitchen over generations. The farm stood as it had for decades, fields ready for harvest, buildings weathered but solid, the fence line still marking boundaries established by our great-grandfather in the 1890s. Yet everything had changed. What had begun as a simple inheritance dispute had revealed layers of complexity none of us had anticipated. Grandpa's classified past, the strategic value of his agricultural innovations, the intersection of corporate government and academic interests in what had seemed like humble farming techniques. So where do we go from here? Dean asked the question, encompassing everything from our personal relationship to the practical management of the farm to the protection of Grandpa's research. We do exactly what he asked in that letter. We work as partners, combining your practical experience with my scientific background. We support the university's efforts to document and share his techniques through the agricultural cooperative. And we resist any attempts to commercialize or classify his work. Dean nodded, his expression reflecting the weight of responsibility we now shared. It won't be easy. AgriGrow won't give up just because we won this round. And the government's interest won't disappear with a state agricultural designation. No, I agreed, but we're better prepared now that we understand what we're protecting and why it matters. Outside, the rain continued its gentle percussion on the roof, the sound that had accompanied generations of Thompson family decisions in this farmhouse. Grandpa was gone, but his vision remained embodied in the fields and structures surrounding us and in the research that represented his true legacy. One day at a time, I echoed Pete's earlier wisdom. That's how Grandpa built all this. Dean nodded, the simple philosophy resonating with his farmer's perspective. One day at a time, he agreed, starting tomorrow. The rain continued through the night, nourishing the fields Grandpa had tended for 60 years. Fields that now represented not just agricultural productivity, but a living laboratory for techniques that might help farmers around the world adapt to changing conditions. The fence post that had revealed his true will still stood at the southwest corner of the property, its hidden compartment now empty, but its symbolism intact. A reminder that the most valuable legacies are often preserved in the most ordinary objects waiting to be discovered by those who know where to look. 3 years have passed since we discovered Grandpa's true will in that fence post. The Thompson farm continues to operate not just as a productive agricultural enterprise, but as a living testament to one man's vision of what farming could be. The red barn still stands proud against the Iowa sky. The white farmhouse remains the heart of our operation, and the John Deere 4020 still runs, a bit noisier now, but reliable as ever. The struggle to protect Grandpa's research didn't end that autumn day when state officials and university representatives stood with us against corporate and federal overreach. Agrigrow made 2 more attempts to acquire the techniques through legal challenges, and one particularly aggressive offer that would have made Dean and me wealthy beyond any farmer's dreams. The federal government's Joint Review Committee spent 18 months examining the research before reluctantly acknowledging that while Project Harvest Moon had provided foundational concepts, Grandpa's subsequent innovations represented independent civilian development beyond any reasonable government claim. What emerged from those battles was something Grandpa would have appreciated, a practical compromise that honored his intent while acknowledging modern realities. The University Agricultural Cooperative now administers his soil enhancement techniques as open-source agricultural innovations available to any farmer willing to implement them properly. A modest licensing fee applies to commercial applications by large agricultural corporations, with proceeds funding scholarships for young people pursuing sustainable farming education. Dean manages the day-to-day operations of the Thompson farm with the same practical efficiency Grandpa valued, while I divide my time between implementing advanced applications of the soil enhancement techniques and working with the university to document results across various soil types and climate conditions. We're different men with different approaches, but we found the balance Grandpa envisioned in his final letter. Pete Johnson, now 85 and officially retired, though still offering daily advice from his porch, has a new barn, built by neighbors in that remarkable tradition of community support that defines rural America at its best. His grandson has taken over operations, implementing Grandpa's techniques with the enthusiasm of youth, combined with respect for traditional wisdom. William Farrell still visits occasionally, bringing perspectives from his long career that help us understand the historical context of Grandpa's work. The government classification of Project Harvest Moon was finally lifted last year, allowing him to speak more freely about those early days when agricultural research and national security concerns intersected in ways that shaped decades of subsequent innovation. Not everything has been resolved perfectly. Some of Grandpa's more advanced techniques remain subjects of ongoing research, their full potential not yet realized. Corporate agriculture continues to dominate the national landscape, with small family farms like ours increasingly rare exceptions rather than the rule. The federal government still occasionally sends representatives to observe our implementation, their interest a reminder that innovations with strategic implications never fully escape official attention. Yet the core victory remains. Grandpa's lifetime of patient, methodical research now benefits hundreds of farmers across the Midwest, with applications expanding nationally and internationally through the university's extension programs. Fields that might have failed during recent drought cycles have maintained productivity not through expensive corporate solutions, but through techniques any farmer can implement with existing equipment and reasonable investment. What Grandpa created here wasn't just agricultural innovation, but a philosophy of stewardship, recognition that the land doesn't belong to us, but is rather entrusted to our care for future generations. His quiet patriotism wasn't expressed in flags or slogans, but in decades of work to strengthen American agriculture against whatever challenges might come, whether from foreign adversaries or changing climate patterns. The fence post that concealed his true will still stands at the southwest corner of our property. I've replaced the hollow compartment with a solid cap, but kept the three notches that marked it as special. Some days when the evening light stretches golden across fields ready for harvest, I walk the fence line and remember the lessons learned since that discovery, that legacies aren't just about inheritance, but about responsibility. That progress doesn't require abandoning tradition, but building thoughtfully upon it. That serving your country sometimes means standing firm against those who claim to represent its interests, but have forgotten its founding principles. Next spring, the university is launching the Richard Thompson Agricultural Innovation Center on land adjacent to our farm, a research facility dedicated to developing practical, accessible techniques that help ordinary farmers adapt to changing conditions. Dean's daughter and my son, both still in high school, have already expressed interest in agricultural careers that might someday continue the work their great-grandfather began nearly 8 decades ago. The most valuable things, as Grandpa said, are often hidden where people least expect to find them. Sometimes in a fence post on an ordinary Iowa farm. Sometimes in the patient, dedicated work of a man who understood that true innovation isn't measured in patents or profits, but in fields that remain productive when others fail, and in knowledge freely shared rather than jealously guarded. That's the real will he left us. Not just the distribution of property, but the responsibility to carry forward a vision of agriculture that serves the many rather than enriching the few. One fence post at a time, one field at a time, one season at a time.